Hey guys, tonight we peel back the sickly silk of Spain's darkest throne and step quietly into the spoiled, flickering world of a man who ruled with both impotence and cruelty, Ferdinand VII. You're here, inside a room soaked in velvet. The curtains are drawn tight, not to block the sun. There's little of it left, but to preserve the illusion that all is still right in this kingdom of lies. It smells of sweat and clove oil. The wallpaper peels just behind a golden crucifix, and somewhere in the next room, a young queen is weeping quietly into the hem of her nightgown. You don't know it yet, but this is the heart of Spain's decay, beating under the sickly robes of the man history tried to forget, and you're standing right beside him. This is the story of Ferdinand VII, a king so obsessed with control that he stripped his own country bare just to feel like a man. A ruler whose reign wobbled between utter incompetence and medieval cruelty. You probably won't survive this journey with your faith in royalty intact. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop your location and local time in the comments. I love seeing where and when you're listening from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge through the fog of early 19th century Spain, watching the royal banners fade under the weight of disappointment. Ferdinand was never supposed to be a great king, but what no one expected, what history barely dares to whisper, is how grotesquely he would fail and how far he would drag a whole nation with him into that failure. Born in 1784, Ferdinand was the first son of Charles IV and Maria Luisa of Parma. And if that sentence already sounds like a snoozy textbook opener, here's your first little slap of reality. Maria Luisa may not have even been his real mother. In fact, historians still argue whether Ferdinand was the biological child of the king or just a pawn produced by her alleged lover, the Prime Minister Manuel de Godoy, a man the court considered both a genius and a slippery narcissist. Yes, even in 1784, royal paternity drama could shake up an empire. You imagine little Ferdinand growing up in the shadowy palace halls, dressed in miniature velvet breeches, scowling under portraits of ancestors who once led conquests and crushed rebellions. He wasn't loved. That's important to remember. He wasn't even liked. Charles IV was more interested in hunting than ruling, and Maria Luisa was too busy cozying up to Godoy to pay much attention to her glum-faced son. Even his tutors reported him as suspicious, sulky, and slow to learn. One remarked that teaching Ferdinand was like lighting a candle in a wet cave. Charming, right? But here's where things take a strange twist. Ferdinand didn't retreat. He absorbed the dysfunction like a sponge. He watched closely how flattery and manipulation bent his father. He noticed how Godoy could override royal decisions with a smirk. And instead of dreaming of glory like a normal crown prince, he began dreaming of revenge. By the time he was a teenager, Ferdinand was already plotting to remove his own father from the throne. You picture him, barely 16, scribbling letters to allies in the court, swearing oaths in dark corners, and whispering conspiracies under the watch of dusty saints painted on the ceiling. Not exactly your average teen rebellion. Now, what was happening outside the palace was just as chaotic. Spain, once a titan, was now a lumbering relic. Napoleon Bonaparte had been sweeping across Europe like a glittery plague, toppling monarchies and leaving little republics like gift wrappers in his wake. Charles IV, bless his deer-shooting heart, had no clue how to deal with this. So he leaned harder and harder on Godoy, whose plan somehow involved cozying up to France, then Britain, then France again, until Spain was a diplomatic doormat with a crown on top. And Ferdinand? He was watching all this like a man waiting for an opening in a bar fight. The opportunity came in 1807. A mysterious letter surfaced, one of many actually, where Ferdinand had apparently been reaching out to Napoleon directly, not to warn him or fight him. No, to ask for help removing his dad. Can you imagine that? The Crown Prince of Spain sliding a note to the French Emperor, basically saying, hey, want to team up and knock my dad off the throne? I'll even throw in some nice wine. Of course, this backfired. Ferdinand was caught, humiliated, and publicly forgiven, in a ceremony so dripping with awkward tension you'd think it was a royal roast. Still, the damage was done. Charles IV knew his son was disloyal. Ferdinand knew his father was weak. And Godoy just kept cashing in on the drama. Here's your first bit of quirky fringe history. During this mess, some nobles began referring to Ferdinand behind closed doors as El Príncipe Murciélago, the Bat Prince. Why? Because, according to gossip, he refused to go outside during daylight for months, afraid someone might assassinate him. He would skulk through halls at twilight, lurking in shadows, obsessed with omens and haunted by the idea that the Virgin Mary disapproved of him. Who knows, maybe she did. The final push came in 1808. Spain was collapsing under economic strain, famine was creeping in, and the people were getting restless. Suddenly, like rats abandoning a ghost ship, the Spanish royal family made a strange decision. They would all travel to Bayonne, France, to meet with Napoleon. Imagine that, packing up the royal court and heading into the mouth of the beast like it's a summer vacation. Napoleon, of course, saw an opening. In one of the boldest cons in European history, he essentially kidnapped the entire royal family at Bayonne. There, in a series of bizarre, slow-motion abdications, Charles IV gave up the throne to Ferdinand, who then gave it right back to Napoleon, who then handed it to his brother, Joseph Bonaparte. Let's pause and breathe that in. Spain, one of Europe's oldest monarchies, just got passed around like a cursed family heirloom at a garage sale. Historians still argue whether Ferdinand acted out of fear or strategy. Was he coerced into giving up the throne? Or did he truly believe Napoleon would protect him long term? Either way, it didn't matter. He was shipped off to France, essentially as a political hostage, and Spain burned. While Spanish guerrillas fought tooth and nail against the French occupation, their king, their so-called savior, was lounging in a French chateau, playing dominoes and eating imported fruits. You'd think he'd be restless to reclaim his kingdom. You'd be wrong. He actually got quite comfortable. But time has a way of unraveling even the tightest lies. By 1814, Napoleon was starting to lose his grip on Europe. The Spanish resistance had held on, and foreign armies were marching through France like angry tourists. Ferdinand saw his chance, and oh boy, did he seize it. When he returned to Spain, the people greeted him like a messiah. Church bells rang. Portraits were dusted off. Streets were flooded with flowers. They called him El Disa, the Desired One. It was like a royal redemption arc. But you know how this kind of story always ends. The moment Ferdinand touched the crown again, everything changed. He tore up the liberal constitution the people had drafted in his absence. He exiled or executed anyone who had cooperated with the Cortes. He reinstalled the Inquisition, not as a symbol, but as an active paperwork signing department. He even had statues of himself erected in plazas still reeking of war. And as for the people, the ones who welcomed him back with open arms, he forgot them. Just like that. You watch as the velvet throne closes around Ferdinand's bloated ego like a coffin. This isn't redemption. It's revenge. And it's only just begun. You're walking beside him now, Ferdinand, the freshly recrowned monarch of Spain, El Deseado, the Desired One. But the shine is already fading. His lips curl into that too familiar sneer, the one he practiced since boyhood. The kind that says, "You needed me, now you'll pay for it." You're in Madrid, spring of 1814. There's music in the streets and bodies in the dungeons. This is the Prince of Nothing Good, finally on his throne, and it only takes a few weeks for everything to sour. See, during his exile in France, Ferdinand didn't do much reading. He didn't pick up philosophy or learn how to govern. He certainly didn't study economics or the art of peacemaking. What he did study obsessively was who betrayed him, who supported the liberal constitution of 1812, who dared suggest that the king should share power. He kept names. He memorized faces. He made lists. And the moment he stepped off the carriage and into the warm Spanish sun, he started hunting. You watch nobles, soldiers, even students dragged off in the night, accused of heresy against the monarchy. Some are beheaded. Others disappear into filthy cells and are never heard from again. Those lucky enough to escape flee to England or the Americas. Everyone else just lowers their eyes and whispers prayers to saints that probably aren't listening anymore. Now, here's your mainstream historical fact. This period, from 1814 to 1820, is officially known as the 6 years of absolute rule. Sounds clinical, doesn't it? What was in reality was a royal tantrum stretched over half a decade. Ferdinand rules by decree. He cancels every progressive reform made in his absence. Gone are free press laws, civil rights guarantees, and any hint of democracy. The universities are shut down. The parliament is dissolved. The Inquisition is restored with full authority. Yes, that Inquisition, the one with racks, red robes, and an impressive record of making people confess to crimes they never imagined. Ferdinand liked it because it was thorough. It reminded him of when kings were feared, not questioned. But you're not just watching a power grab. You're watching something pettier, darker. It's personal now. Ferdinand starts hiring men with titles like Inspector of Loyalty. Their job? Root out people who had even considered constitutional government. Some families are arrested because a cousin once owned a banned book. One famously unfortunate tailor is tortured for weeks because he stitched buttons too close to the French fashion of the time. It wasn't even his idea. He just ran out of thread. Here's where things get uncomfortably absurd. Ferdinand begins to suspect that art might be seditious. He has murals painted over, statues removed, plays canceled mid-performance. Even music is censored. A popular madrigal group is disbanded because one of their tunes sounded too hopeful. And all the while, Ferdinand struts through palaces in ill-fitting uniforms, hand on sword, pretending the nation still loved him. You watch him pose for portraits in which he looks 10 years younger than he really is, painted surrounded by golden rays like some deranged sun god. But beneath that painted smile, something's rotting. Because for all the power he's amassed, Ferdinand can't seem to shake one crucial truth. He has no heir. He's been married, but so far nothing. No son, not even a whisper of a royal pregnancy. And in a monarchy where legacy is everything, this is a ticking bomb. So, naturally, Ferdinand begins to unravel in new and imaginative ways. He starts blaming his advisors, then his enemies, then quite suddenly his wives. You stand beside him as he stares blankly at his young queen, Maria Antonia, and accuses her of being bewitched by liberals. This is a woman who's barely out of her teens, married off to him for diplomacy. She writes letters back to Austria describing Spain as a prison wrapped in lace. One letter reads, "The king will not look me in the eye. He avoids the light. He believes I have cursed his seed." Maria Antonia dies mysteriously at age 21. Officially, it's tuberculosis. Unofficially, some say poisoning. Others say suicide. Historians still argue whether Ferdinand had her quietly removed out of rage, desperation, or simply royal convenience. Her death is barely acknowledged in court. Ferdinand grieves the way a man might mourn a broken pipe, mildly annoyed, slightly inconvenienced, and eager to replace it. And here comes a strange tidbit that sticks to this chapter like wine to silk. Ferdinand becomes obsessed with mercury baths. Yes, mercury, the liquid metal that glows silver and kills you slowly. He'd read somewhere, or perhaps heard from one of his traveling healers, that mercury could restore virility. You watch as he soaks in steaming tubs of the stuff, emerging with flushed cheeks and blistered skin, claiming he feels reborn. It's like watching a candle cheer because it's on fire. But the mercury doesn't work. Not really. And Ferdinand starts spiraling. He turns his attention inward, writing strange, ranting letters to himself. Whole pages of looping sentences, underlined phrases, and sketches of swords stabbing serpents with his name scrawled in the margins. You find one tucked inside a prayer book. It reads, "They think me weak. I shall bleed Spain into obedience." Now, here's the political whiplash. In 1820, after 6 years of tyranny, an unexpected revolt erupts. A liberal military officer named Rafael del Riego declares that Spain should return a constitutional government. He marches with troops, seizes towns, and calls Ferdinand out publicly. Ferdinand, caught completely off guard, panics. Not just a little. He flees into a locked room and sobs for hours. When pressed for a response, he famously mutters, "Let us feign submission until the wind changes." And just like that, he agrees to restore the Constitution of 1812. He signs it with shaking hands. The people cheer. The liberals rejoice. But you, dear listener, you know him now. You know he's lying. Behind the fake smiles and public ceremonies, Ferdinand is already plotting revenge. He plays the humble king while sending secret envoys to other monarchs in Europe, begging them to help him crush the liberal disease, which leads to one of the strangest historical alliances of the century. In 1823, France, yes, France, invades Spain, but this time on behalf of the monarchy. That's right. Ferdinand calls on the French to save his throne from his own people. They're known as the 100,000 Sons of St. Louis, and they sweep through Spain with terrifying precision. The liberal government collapses. Riego is captured and hanged, and Ferdinand reestablishes himself as absolute monarch for the second time. You stand in the back of the church where he gives his victory speech. He tells the nation that he's forgiven them, though his tone feels more like a jailer reading out sentencing. He calls the Constitution a satanic invention and makes it clear that Spain belongs to him now, body and soul. In the years that follow, Ferdinand becomes more reclusive. His court shrinks. His circle tightens. Paranoia creeps in like mold behind the tapestries. He only trusts priests, sycophants, and foreign apothecaries with mysterious bags of herbs. You once again watch the palace lights flicker at midnight, but now there's something heavier in the air. Ferdinand is king, yes, but also prisoner of his own fear. Every mirror he passes is covered. Every corridor echoes with footsteps that make him flinch. He's haunted not just by ghosts of revolution, but by the crushing knowledge that he has ruled and ruined and still produced nothing. No sun, no future, just shadows and velvet. You're in a grand hallway. The marbles so polished you can see your own uncertainty staring back at you. Candles flicker in sconces shaped like angels, though their eyes look more mournful than divine. At the end of the corridor, a door creaks open, and you step inside a royal nursery that's been waiting for a child that never came. This is Ferdinand as a husband, as a father-in-waiting, as the lonely architect of a broken dynasty. But let's not be fooled. There's nothing tender about it. From the earliest days of his reign, Ferdinand's obsession with producing an heir was more feverish than fatherly. He didn't just want a son, he needed one. The entire illusion of his strength, his divine right to rule, the entire continuity of the Bourbon line, it all depended on something he couldn't control: fertility. And when that realization set in, Ferdinand responded in the only way he knew how: blame, control, and very bad decisions. Let's rewind a moment. His first marriage, to Princess Maria Antonia of Naples, ended in whispers and a quiet funeral. No children, just rumors of infertility, witchcraft, poison, and the haunting image of her last days, a young woman coughing blood into lace. Now you're witnessing his second attempt. It's 1816. The war is over, for now, and Ferdinand is ready to try again. He marries Maria Isabel of Braganza, a Portuguese princess barely 18 years old. She is gentle, soft-spoken, and unprepared for the suffocating weight of Spanish court life. Imagine being her, stepping off the royal carriage into a palace that feels more like a crypt. The servants won't look her in the eye. The ladies-in-waiting whisper behind fans. And the king? He's older now, more bloated, still childless, and increasingly panicked. Maria Isabel is pushed into the royal bedroom with almost sacred urgency. There's no romance, just cold protocol. A priest blesses the bed. A doctor waits outside. You hear her crying the first night. To the public, Ferdinand parades his new bride like a trophy. But behind closed doors, he begins to unravel her, piece by piece. He has her diet strictly monitored. He orders her to avoid stairs, spicy food, loud music, anything that might upset the mystical balance required to trap an heir. He even bans her from wearing perfume, claiming that unnatural scents might cause miscarriage. That's real. He believed that, or pretended to. And yet, finally, she becomes pregnant. You watch the court celebrate with fireworks and processions. Spain exhales. This could be it. This could fix everything. Ferdinand hosts a massive Thanksgiving. He personally orders a tiny golden cradle from Florence. The bells ring for days. But there's no happy ending here. The birth goes terribly wrong. Maria Isabel suffers hours of agony. The doctors are incompetent, fumbling through outdated techniques and feverish prayers. Her child is stillborn. She bleeds endlessly, and you can almost hear her breath slipping away with each drop. She dies on Christmas Day, 1818. And Ferdinand? He doesn't attend her funeral. He shuts himself in his chambers and demands that her portrait be taken down. He claims absurdly that she had weak royal instincts, as if that explained everything. The palace maids later claim they found him drinking alone beside the empty cradle. So what does he do next? He marries again. This time, he's less interested in diplomacy. He wants a wife who is young, very young, pure, pliant, and above all, fertile, which is how you end up seated at the nauseating royal wedding of Ferdinand VII to Maria Josepha Amalia of Saxony, a girl of just 15 years old. He's 44. This is where even the courtiers start whispering. The wedding is quiet, almost clinical. There's no dancing, no joy, just the somber tick of obligation and the cold eyes of nobles who don't dare flinch. You notice the archbishop looking deeply uncomfortable during the blessing. Ferdinand has her locked away for weeks after the ceremony. She's not allowed visitors, not even letters home. A team of nuns is assigned to educate her in her new duties, and yes, that means exactly what you think it means. Now for your fringe historical tidbit. According to letters smuggled out by a sympathetic lady-in-waiting, Maria Josepha refused to consummate the marriage for over 6 months out of sheer terror. She believed sex was a sin unless blessed directly by the Pope. Ferdinand had to write to the Vatican for permission to sleep with his wife. When the letter finally arrived, he reportedly waved it like a schoolboy with a hall pass. The marriage, unsurprisingly, produced no children. You can't help but notice that Ferdinand doesn't blame himself. Not once. It's always the women, or the doctors, or the stars. And as the years pass, the whispers begin again. Maybe the king is cursed. Maybe the bloodline is too thin. Maybe, just maybe, he's simply incapable. But Ferdinand? He refuses to believe it. He starts seeing strange healers again, quacks and mystics with oils, powders, rituals. One Catalan doctor convinces him to sleep on horsehair for virility. Another demands he drink vinegar soaked in crushed pearls. None of it works. And yet, you can't look away, because there's a growing madness behind his eyes. You see it in the way he touches religious relics too long. The way he stares at pregnant women with a mix of envy and fury. The way he paces outside the nursery at night, whispering prayers to saints that haven't been canonized yet. One winter evening, he orders the royal chapel cleared and spends hours alone inside, sobbing at the feet of a statue of Saint Anne. When servants return in the morning, they find a note in Ferdinand's handwriting. If no son comes, let my enemies be crushed in place of an heir. A cryptic curse? A confession? Or just another tantrum? Historians still argue whether Ferdinand's sterility was physical or psychological. Some point to illness in childhood. Others suspect syphilis, though no hard evidence survives. A few even suggest that trauma from his early court isolation created a permanent block, a man so emotionally stunted he could never truly function as a partner, let alone a father. Whatever the truth, the damage is done. Spain has no clear heir. The Carlists, supporters of Ferdinand's ultra-conservative brother, Don Carlos, are circling. The liberals are waiting for the next revolt. And Ferdinand? He's sitting in his dark palace, aging rapidly, surrounded by empty cradles and broken saints, trying to will a dynasty into existence by sheer force of will. And now, a final whisper to carry with you tonight. You walk past a room, long locked, never used. Inside, a golden crib still sits under a canopy of royal blue. A tiny silver rattle lies untouched. No one speaks of that room anymore. Not the servants, not the priests, not the king. But sometimes, late at night, they say he unlocks it, just to stare. You find yourself back in the same shadowed palace, but the doors are open now. Not to let in air, but because the rot inside has become too pungent to trap. You follow the scent of incense and mildew into a meeting hall that feels more like a confession chamber than a seat of power. This is the era of Napoleon's human puppet, when Ferdinand VII becomes both betrayer and betrayed, a hollow king toss between empires like a monarch-shaped chess piece. But let's rewind to set the stage, because this part of the nightmare began with hope. It's the early 1800s, and Spain is a brittle kingdom, one foot in enlightenment, one in the grave. The country's golden age is long gone. The colonies are restless, and the Bourbon court is as functional as a peacock in a snowstorm. The people are hungry. The treasury's bleeding. The crown's advisors? All talk, no solutions. Enter Napoleon Bonaparte, fresh off a victory bender, now eyeing Spain like a pastry left out in the rain. You stand beside Ferdinand as he reads Napoleon's letters, each one laced with sweet threats, polite suggestions, and the scent of gunpowder beneath the wax seal. Ferdinand, still the Prince of Asturias at this point, sees an opportunity. And here's where it gets spectacularly ridiculous. He believes he can manipulate Napoleon. Yes, that Napoleon. Ferdinand thinks that if he flatters the French emperor enough, perhaps offers him a royal alliance, he could dethrone his own father, Charles IV, and finally take power. So he secretly writes Napoleon a letter, then another, then several more, all very hushed, all full of desperate ambition masked as courtly formality. Historians still argue whether Napoleon ever took Ferdinand seriously, or if he just saw a weak link and decided to pull. Either way, by 1807, Spain is toast. Napoleon suggests a meeting in Bayonne in southern France. A quiet chat between monarchs. Maybe a handshake. Maybe a treaty. Instead, what unfolds becomes one of the most bizarre and humiliating collapses in royal history. Picture it. The entire Spanish royal family, including Charles IV, Queen Maria Luisa, Prime Minister Godoy, and yes, Ferdinand himself, travel into enemy territory to discuss the future of Spain. You feel it, don't you? That edge of farce. As if they expected tea and diplomacy, not a trap. Napoleon sits in a velvet chair in Bayonne like a cat welcoming a mouse into his mouth. One by one, he pressures, humiliates, and extracts abdications from the Spanish royals. Charles abdicates first, ostensibly out of outrage at Ferdinand's treachery. Ferdinand accepts the crown. Then, not 24 hours later, under Napoleon's tightening grip, he gives it right back. You're watching a man unmake himself in slow motion. With both father and son stripped of power, Napoleon hands the throne to his own brother, Joseph Bonaparte. A man so deeply unpopular in Spain that people start calling him Pepe Botella or Joe Bottle, mocking both his name and alleged drinking habits. Spain erupts. You hear the creak of gallows, the whisper of knives. Madrid rises in revolt. The Dos de Mayo uprising sparks a war of resistance so fierce and so bitter that it will later be immortalized in Goya's grim paintings. Scenes of executions, screaming mothers, blood splashing across whitewashed walls. It is raw, it is cruel, and it begins, in large part, because Ferdinand abandoned them. Meanwhile, you sit with him in exile, comfortably lodged in Valenque, a chateau in rural France. There's no dungeon, no chains, just wine chests and soft beds. Ferdinand is technically a prisoner, but the kind of prisoner who eats imported pears and writes theatrical letters to Spain, proclaiming his innocence and his love for the people. I am your true king, he insists. I shall return and restore order. But privately, he's doing nothing. He refuses to meet with Spanish patriots. He won't commit to liberal reforms. When emissaries beg him to publicly reject Napoleon's puppet regime and declare war, he just stares at the window and declines to answer. Here's a fringe tidbit that's so very Ferdinand. While in France, he allegedly took to walking in gardens at night, muttering practice speeches to statues. He believed he was destined to return not just as king, but as a savior, crowned by God, vindicated by history. One valet wrote in his journal, "He stands before marble like it can answer back." It's during this time that Ferdinand develops his most insidious political persona, the victim monarch. When he finally is allowed to return to Spain in 1814, as Napoleon's empire begins to crumble, he plays the role to perfection. He arrives dressed simply, clutching a rosary. He lets the crowds carry him in jubilation. They chant, "Viva el Deseado," and he nods, humbly, like a man who has suffered nobly and now comes home. But you remember the letters, the silence, the cowardice. This man didn't lead the resistance. He didn't lift a finger. He waited. He watched. And the moment it was safe, he claimed the credit and grabbed the throne again with both greedy hands. And here's the punchline. When he gets the throne back, he immediately undoes every liberal reform made during his absence. Yes, again, the Constitution of 1812, created during the darkest days of war to give Spain a new path forward, is revoked in a single stroke. He calls it a poisoned dagger wrapped in parchment. Those who wrote it are arrested. Some flee. Others die. You feel the wind change as hope flees the country like smoke from a snuffed-out candle. And what does Ferdinand do with this fresh wave of power? He begins crafting what can only be described as a royal echo chamber. He surrounds himself with flatterers, priests, exiles, and mystics. He refuses to read newspapers. He bans political discussion at court. One noble is exiled for quoting Cicero. Another is jailed for coughing too loudly during a sermon. The country, exhausted, bled dry, still crawling out of the Napoleonic nightmare, is now dragged into a new nightmare. Not of war, but of stillness, of stagnation, of daily, suffocating repression. The irony is grotesque. Napoleon, the man Ferdinand hated, burned across Europe like a comet. Violent, yes, but full of ideas, reforms, codes, infrastructure. Ferdinand, in contrast, snuffs out every candle of change. It's as if he wants Spain not just to survive, but to rewind. And you, watching him now, seated on his throne in a stiff-necked coat, face waxy with sweat, eyes darting from minister to minister, you realize something chilling. He believes he saved Spain. He believes he's the hero. Even now, as famine tightens its grip, as colonies begin to mutter about revolution, as debt strangles the treasury and people whisper about regicide in the alleys of Madrid, Ferdinand sleeps well. Because he has the crown. Because he has the cross. Because the people cheered once and he never stopped hearing it. Even in his dreams. You're not in a palace anymore. You're inside a spinning roulette wheel made of velvet, rage, and royal paranoia. The corridors echo with the shuffle of secret police boots. The air smells like musty incense and slowly rotting paper. This is abdications, dungeons, repeat, and it's where Ferdinand's reign becomes a looping, feverish cycle of betrayal, blood, and royal reboots no one asked for. When people call Ferdinand VII a tyrant, they usually mean this period. Though trying to assign one clean label to this man is like trying to label spoiled milk just sour. It's curdled, it's clotted, and it's somehow still being served at every meal. So, here we are in the 1820s again. The country's just experienced a liberal revolt. Ferdinand swore on holy relics he'd uphold the Constitution. Then, classic Ferdinand, he backstabbed his way right out of that promise. Here's how. As you remember from Section 2, Rafael del Riego's army forced Ferdinand to accept constitutional limits. For 3 years, Spain has something almost resembling a liberal monarchy. There are newspapers again, political clubs, even a cautious optimism. But behind that brittle optimism lies Ferdinand, coiled like a viper in a crown, playing the long game. He signs the Constitution, yes, but he's also secretly writing to every monarch in Europe, begging for help. And in 1823, help arrives in the form of the 100,000 Sons of St. Louis, a French army sent by the so-called Holy Alliance, Russia, Austria, Prussia, and France, all terrified by the idea of Spain's revolution infecting their own populations. Ferdinand doesn't even pretend to be neutral. He meets the invaders with open arms, declaring he has come to deliver his people from their sins. Within weeks, Riego is captured, tortured, and executed. The Constitution is torn to shreds again. That's right. You're watching the second major abdication / rethroning of this one man. Abdicated to Napoleon. Reinstated. Abdicated under liberal pressure. Reinstated again. It's like he's allergic to retirement. Or morality. Or both. This is when Ferdinand begins to experiment with what might be called rotational tyranny. One day, he reinstates the Inquisition. The next, he suspends it. One day, he pardons a group of imprisoned liberals. A week later, he arrests them again for conspiring with Satan. He's not ruling anymore. He's punishing. It's the reign of a man who treats governance like a grudge match. You see it in his eyes during audiences. The way he tilts his head like a parrot, testing for loyalty in every breath. You watch ministers kneel, not in respect, but in desperate hope they won't be the next to disappear. He once told his advisors, half jokingly, "I don't need enemies. I have family." Which brings us to the next layer of this slow-burning horror show. Because while Spain is crumbling under debt, famine, and colonial unrest, Ferdinand's court is obsessing over succession again. Still no heir. Still no clarity. Still a massive, festering question at the heart of a monarchy. Who takes over when this rotten branch finally snaps? The obvious answer is his brother, Don Carlos, a man as reactionary as Ferdinand, but arguably more stable and terrifying in his certainty. Carlos wants an ultra-Catholic, absolutist Spain. No parliament, no liberals, no tolerance, just crowns, crosses, and iron rule. But Ferdinand hesitates. He doesn't trust Carlos. He doesn't trust anyone. So he dithers, delays, spends hours walking alone in gardens, then returns with half-signed decrees and contradictory laws. One day, Carlos is heir apparent. The next, he's persona non grata. No one knows where they stand, not even the king. Now, your mainstream historical fact. During this time, Spain loses nearly all of its colonies in Latin America. Mexico declares independence. So does Venezuela, Colombia, Argentina. One after another, the jewels of the Spanish Empire vanish, and Ferdinand barely reacts. It's not that he doesn't care. It's that he can't focus. While generals and diplomats beg for reinforcements, Ferdinand is too busy interrogating his cooks about whether foreign spices are being smuggled into his stew. One surviving memo from 1824 reads, "The king has requested all books in French be removed from the palace library, as they may contain revolution." Yes, he believed language itself was dangerous. This, of course, isn't sustainable. The Spanish people are once again restless. The peasants are starving. The nobles are confused. The liberals are terrified. And Ferdinand? He responds with a new round of dungeons. You follow him into a side wing of the royal palace. It's colder here, darker. The air changes. This is where prisoners are kept. Not high-profile traitors, but quiet dissidents. Teachers, poets, newspaper boys. He is soundproofed, so he won't hear their screams. He has the walls painted with thick whitewash to cover the blood. But you feel it in your chest. The silence is heavier than noise. And now, a fringe tidbit for the books. Ferdinand allegedly kept a wax model of himself in one of the cells. Life-sized, fully dressed, positioned on a fake throne with a fake crown. Why? So prisoners could be dragged in to face the king. It was meant as psychological torture. No, I'm not joking. That happened. But here's the kicker. Even this wasn't enough to maintain control. By 1827, revolts are breaking out again, especially in Catalonia, where secret liberal networks are spreading underground. Ferdinand's response? A national crackdown so intense it nearly bankrupts the treasury. He hires thousands of spies, censors every major city newspaper, and personally signs arrest warrants by candlelight until his hands cramp. Still, nothing works. The country has had enough, and Ferdinand knows it. You see it in his sudden, awkward shift around 1829. He begins making public appearances again, smiling, waving, playing the humble monarch. He reopens theaters. He even attends a few masses without demanding extra incense. He's trying to soften his image. But by now, the damage is irreversible. Historians still argue whether this softening was a sincere attempt at redemption or just a strategic pause before another crackdown. Most agree it was too little, too late. Even Ferdinand's own supporters are growing nervous. The royal court is now split in two: those who support Don Carlos and those praying for a miracle pregnancy from the king's fourth wife. We'll get to her soon. Fights break out in Parliament. Some nobles resign outright. Others just vanish, swept into that velvet fog of silence Ferdinand always preferred. You stand at the center of a monarchy spinning in circles, chewing its own tail, bleeding itself dry for the sake of one man's ego. And that man? You find him in his private chambers at midnight, flipping through an illustrated bestiary. He lingers on the picture of a snake eating itself. He chuckles, then whispers, "Loyalty is a loop. The loop is tightening, and it's about to choke the whole kingdom." You're back in the royal chamber. Thick tapestries, stale incense, and a peculiar stillness in the air, like the hush before a thunderstorm. But this time, something's different. There's perfume in the hallway. A string quartet stumbles through an off-key waltz somewhere in the background. Servants whisper and peek around corners. Because Ferdinand VII, King of Spain, bloated tyrant, enemy of enlightenment, has decided to get married. Again. Yes, it's time for wife number 4. The court dresses up. The priests rehearse their lines. And the noble families sigh, knowing this isn't about love, it's about dynasty. You follow the procession as Ferdinand, now deep into his 40s and visibly deteriorating, waddles down the aisle with Maria Cristina of the Two Sicilies, a 23-year-old niece of his first wife. She's young, she's pious, and most importantly, she still has a functioning womb. That's all Ferdinand cares about now. This wedding isn't just another royal formality. It's the last desperate dice roll of a man running out of time. The year is 1829. Spain is choking. The treasury's in ruins. The colonies are gone. The court is split into hostile factions. And Ferdinand? He's dying. Slowly. Badly. His body is a battlefield of untreated illnesses, stress-induced obesity, and who knows how many failed mercury cures. You notice his hands tremble during the ceremony. His face looks waxy under the crown. When he leans in to kiss his bride, Maria Cristina flinches. And yet, by the end of the night, he's already declared the wedding a miracle of the bloodline. You're not surprised. He's always been better at grand delusion than governing. Now, here's your mainstream historical fact. Maria Cristina would become one of the most consequential queens in Spanish history. Not because she was powerful herself, but because of what her womb produced. Because yes, after years of miscarriages, deaths, and empty cradles, Maria Cristina finally does what none of Ferdinand's previous wives could. She gets pregnant. You can feel the tension ripple through Spain like a thunderclap. The conservatives are thrilled until they hear the news. It's a girl, Isabella. And this is where it gets extra spicy, because now we're entering one of the greatest constitutional crises in Spanish history. So let's unpack. Traditionally, under the Salic law, a Frankish rule imported by the Bourbon dynasty, women couldn't inherit the throne. It's been used across Europe to justify male-only succession for centuries. So even though Ferdinand has a daughter, his younger brother Don Carlos remains next in line, at least in the eyes of the hardliners. But Ferdinand? He doesn't want Carlos to rule. Not now. Not ever. Carlos is everything he fears. Cold, uncompromising, ultra-Catholic, and popular with the army. If Carlos inherits, he'll likely purge the court, punish the liberals, and erase Ferdinand's pathetic legacy from history. So Ferdinand makes a move no one expects. He repeals the Salic law. This is a man who crushed liberal constitutions, burned books, and silenced reformers. And now he's rewriting succession law to let a baby girl become queen. Historians still argue whether he did it out of genuine paternal instinct or simply spite for his brother. But the effect is seismic. You stand in the grand hall as he signs the Pragmatic Sanction of 1830, surrounded by bishops who squirm in discomfort and nobles who pretend to cheer. Behind their smiles, civil war is already whispering, because Don Carlos doesn't take this quietly. Oh no, he declares the repeal invalid. He calls it heresy. His supporters, the Carlists, begin organizing in secret. They flood churches, taverns, and military barracks with pamphlets denouncing Ferdinand as a traitor to Catholic Spain. They whisper about restoring order and God's plan. And then, just when you think things can't get messier, Ferdinand's body starts falling apart like spoiled fruit. By 1832, he's suffering from gout, kidney stones, chronic ulcers, and a nervous disorder that leaves him twitching and mumbling in public. His tongue swells so badly he can't speak clearly. His feet are so infected that he has to be carried to court in a gilded litter. The people begin calling him El Rey Sapo, the Toad King. That's your quirky tidbit of the section. The nickname stuck. Street children would chant it as his carriage passed. Viva El Rey Sapo. They'd leap like frogs behind him, laughing as guards chase them off. But Ferdinand isn't laughing. He's dying. And terrified, you find him slumped in a brocaded chair, drooling into his cravat, as Maria Cristina reads royal documents aloud. He tries to issue orders, but his speech slurs into a frothy mumble. Ministers nod politely, then do whatever they want. Then it happens. In late September of 1832, word spreads. The king is dying. Priests are summoned. Confessors gather. Last rites are whispered over his trembling form, and the court goes into absolute panic. Don Carlos rushes to Madrid. His supporters begin celebrating. They assume Isabella's claim will die with her father. But Ferdinand, in one final Lazarus-style twist, recovers. Yes, he doesn't die. Like some dark miracle, he wakes up, angry, confused, and vengeful. And his first order of business? Purge the Carlists. He arrests Carlos's advisors. He reaffirms Isabella's right to the throne. He reissues the Pragmatic Sanction. And he swears that the crown will go to his daughter, even if it burns the country down. You sit beside his bed during those last months. His skin is gray. His voice, a papery rasp. He clutches a tiny portrait of Isabella and mutters prayers between curses. He knows his time is short. Spain, meanwhile, is cracking. Carlist uprisings flare in the north. Liberals and conservatives eye each other across parliament halls with increasing venom. And Isabella? She's just a toddler, wide-eyed and completely unaware of the war her existence is about to cause. Finally, in September 1833, after weeks of agony, Ferdinand VII dies. He's 49 years old. His legacy? A broken country, a civil war in the making, and a daughter too young to rule. When they lay him in the royal crypt, the streets are silent. Not from mourning, but from waiting. Everyone knows the storm is coming, because Ferdinand didn't leave behind peace, or wisdom, or progress. He left behind a battlefield. You wake to the low toll of cathedral bells and the stale perfume of state mourning. The king is dead, but no one seems entirely sure what that means. Ferdinand VII, the most paranoid, perverted, power-hoarding monarch in recent Spanish memory, has finally left the stage. But his final act? That was the real twist. Because instead of leaving the crown to a strong military man, a brother, or even a regent with proper authority, Ferdinand left it to a 3-year-old girl. A baby with a lacy bonnet, a confused stare, and no idea that half the country want her gone. You're now standing in the heart of a royal custody crisis that will become the First Carlist War. It's not just a succession dispute. It's an identity crisis for an entire nation. Who gets to define Spain? The old guard of pious, male-only absolutism, or the fragile hope of liberal monarchy led by a toddler queen? Let's walk through the wreckage Ferdinand left behind. Queen Maria Cristina, now a widow and mother to Queen Isabella II, is named regent. Technically, she's in charge, but in reality, she's caught between two roaring fires: the Carlists, led by Ferdinand's ultra-conservative brother Don Carlos, and the liberals, who see Isabella as a path to modernization. From the start, it's chaos. Carlists declare that the pragmatic sanction, which Ferdinand used to change the succession law, is invalid, illegal, even blasphemous. They insist that Don Carlos is the rightful king. They say God never intended a woman to sit on the throne, especially not one who drools on it. The liberals, meanwhile, are desperate to keep Carlos out. He's a theocratic nightmare in waiting. If he takes power, there will be no more newspapers, no parliament, no civil codes, just crucifixes, censorship, and absolute monarchy with a sword. So the stage is set. The baby queen versus the holy war prince. And just like that, in 1833, Spain explodes into civil war. This is your mainstream historical fact. The First Carlist War, 1833 to 1840, was a brutal, bitter conflict across northern Spain, especially in the Basque Country, Navarre, Aragon, and Catalonia. Villages were torn apart. Families chose sides. Neighbors reported each other. Children hid in caves while armies marched overhead. You walk through these ravaged towns, burned churches, shattered statues, and bullet-pocked courtyards. Every wall holds a new symbol. One day it's Viva Isabel II. The next day, Viva Carlos V. Neither side is clean. The Carlists recruit heavily from rural Spain, smallholders, deeply religious peasants, and traditionalist nobles who think the Enlightenment was a French plague. Their soldiers fight under banners of the Virgin Mary and shout Latin prayers as they charge. Their vision of Spain is frozen in time, feudal, hierarchical, obedient. The liberals, on the other hand, are an unstable alliance. Bourgeois reformers, ex-military officers, constitutional monarchists, even some former revolutionaries. Their generals are often underfunded, undermanned, and too busy arguing in Madrid salons to properly plan the next assault. It's less a war than a rolling, shrieking collapse. And Maria Cristina? You're watching her age 10 years in 12 months. She tries to stay above it all, sitting on the regent's throne with a portrait of Isabella beside her, issuing royal decrees that no one reads, and appointing ministers who last about as long as fruit in the summer sun. One prime minister serves just 11 days. Another flees the country entirely. Now here's your quirky historical tidbit. To sway public support, liberal propagandists commissioned tiny Isabella dolls, dressed in royal lace, sold in markets across Madrid. Yes, the Spanish crown turns a literal toddler into merchandising. Each doll comes with a tiny scroll declaring constitutional liberty. It's adorable. It's desperate. It doesn't work. Meanwhile, Don Carlos is out in the field rallying support. His image is everywhere in the north. Portraits in churches, stories told by candlelight, old women weeping and declaring him the one true king. He even issues royal proclamations of his own, styling himself Carlos V and offering pardons to liberals who repent. The war gets uglier. Guerrilla bands form. Executions become routine. One general famously orders prisoners to be shot on the hour, every hour, for an entire day. Another slaughters an entire village suspected of harboring liberals. Maria Cristina begs the British and French for support. They send ships, weapons, and advisors, though they mostly advise from safe distance. Back in Madrid, Queen Isabella is being raised in a gilded cage. She has dolls, tutors, and an army of handlers, but she's essentially a political talisman, waved in public whenever the liberals need a rallying cry. Maria Cristina stages walks through the capital with her daughter, flanked by guards, waving stiffly to crowds that don't know whether to cheer or run. And through it all, Ferdinand's ghost hangs heavy. You feel it in every council meeting, every argument over succession, every whisper about whether this whole thing could have been avoided if only he'd had a son, or governed better, or not pitted his countrymen against each other for decades on end. Historians still argue whether Ferdinand truly understood the civil war he was igniting. Some say he knew and didn't care. Others claim he was so consumed with his personal hatred for Carlos that he'd rather risk national collapse than let his brother sit on the throne. What we do know, he left no roadmap. There was no structure, no clear line of command, No plan for Isabella's education or regency. Just a country on fire and a child queen stuck in the smoke. And now, let's follow one final thread tonight. In 1837, with the war dragging on and liberal troops finally pushing back against the Carlist strongholds, Maria Cristina is forced to accept a new constitution. It's far more liberal than anything Ferdinand ever allowed. It enshrines civil rights, a constitutional monarchy, and a two-chamber parliament. It's the ultimate irony. Ferdinand VII spent his life choking the Enlightenment out of Spain. He burned books, jailed philosophers, and bathed his throne in reactionary fear. And yet, his daughter's reign begins with the very reforms he fought to destroy. The new Spain, bloody, limping, divided, is still emerging from smoke. It won't be stable. It won't be peaceful, but it's different. And as for Don Carlos, he retreats across the border into France, defeated but not broken. He will return, or at least his followers will, because the Carlist cause doesn't die with a war. It lingers like a stubborn stain on Spain's future. 2 more civil wars will follow, all claiming to fix what Ferdinand broke. You turn back one last time, looking at the child queen on her tiny throne, blinking at the sunlight through stained glass. She has no idea what she's inherited, but you do. You open your eyes in a dimly lit archive, paper dry, air thick with the smell of forgotten ink and crumbling leather. Scrolls, edicts, royal decrees. They're stacked floor to ceiling, a paper monument to one man's desperate need for control. This is not a library. It's Ferdinand VII's paper kingdom, where he ruled with a trembling quill and the paranoia of a man who saw conspiracy in every comma. Tonight, you'll be sifting through his real legacy. Not just the civil war, or the marriages, or the throne passed to a toddler queen, but the systemic, obsessive, and almost hilariously contradictory policies he used to rule. You begin in 1814, the first time Ferdinand reclaims his throne after Napoleon's humiliating occupation and his own cozy exile in Valencia. He returns to Spain triumphantly, promising gratitude and unity. But what does he do as soon as the cheering fades? He abolishes the liberal constitution of 1812. Personally, without consultation. That constitution, written during the resistance to Napoleon, had become a symbol of hope. It limited the king's power, gave basic civil rights, and even acknowledged the colonies as part of the nation. It was, in short, Spain's baby steps into modernity. Ferdinand tosses it out like spoiled wine. Within weeks, he restores absolute monarchy, reactivates the Inquisition, and begins a purge so wide-reaching that historians still debate how many lives were quietly destroyed in back rooms. Universities are closed or censored. Newspapers vanish. Printing presses are dismantled. The Enlightenment? Canceled. Literally. Here's your mainstream historical fact. From 1814 to 1820, Spain was ruled under a period known as the Sexenio Absolutista, 6 years of absolute rule, marked by crushing repression and deep aggression. It was as if time itself had been rewound. One of his first decrees banned the sale of foreign books, unless they were religious or scientific. And even then, only if they passed through 3 layers of censors. One book was banned because it mentioned the moon too enthusiastically. Yes, really. You're walking through his policies now like a labyrinth, each door opening into a darker, narrower hallway. A university professor is arrested for owning a French dictionary. A poet is jailed for writing about birds because the metaphor was too free. A woman is exiled to Majorca for wearing her hair in the French manner. Historians still argue whether Ferdinand truly believed in these micro-crackdowns, or whether he simply didn't know how to stop once he started. Now let's talk spies. Ferdinand built a domestic surveillance system worthy of a paranoid Bond villain. He recruited monks, priests, retired soldiers, even teenage boys to report suspicious activity. Neighborhoods had official morality monitors. Taverns were bugged. Post offices opened letters as routine policy. One letter, intercepted in 1817, led to the arrest of an entire family because a grandmother had written the phrase, "If only we had a smarter king." They were held for 9 months. You pause, let that sink in. Ferdinand wasn't governing Spain. He He was gaslighting it, and nowhere is that more evident than in how he used the church. For Ferdinand, religion wasn't a personal compass. It was a political hammer. He restored the Inquisition not to defend doctrine, but to intimidate and punish. Confessors were told to report unpatriotic thoughts. Priests who refused were quietly replaced. In one bizarre case, a monk was defrocked for telling a joke during confession. The punchline? Even saints get tired of kings. A soldier overheard and reported him. He was never seen again. Here's your quirky tidbit of the section. Ferdinand issued an actual edict prohibiting excessive laughter in public gatherings. His justification? Laughter was a sign of moral looseness and French sensibility. So yes, he literally tried to ban chuckling. But the deeper you go, the more surreal it becomes. Ferdinand created parallel legal systems, secret councils, royal boards, and temporary tribunals. No one knew which court had the final say. This meant he was the only true authority. All roads led back to the palace. One nobleman, trying to resolve a land dispute, was forced to file the same complaint in 4 different courts, each of which told him to await royal guidance. He died waiting. Meanwhile, the economy was circling the drain. Ferdinand's policies crushed commerce. By banning foreign books, he isolated Spanish universities. By censoring newspapers, he stifled innovation. By clamping down on colonial trade, he tanked revenue. Spain's GDP, not that they called it that, shrank by nearly 20% between 1815 and 1820. And when inflation skyrocketed, Ferdinand responded with a ban on discussing prices in public. Yes, that was his solution. Don't talk about the problem. And then came 1820, the year the loop cracked. A liberal uprising, led by Colonel Rafael del Riego, forces Ferdinand to restore the Constitution of 1812. For 3 glorious years, Spain becomes almost modern again. Parliament is reactivated. Freedom of the press returns. Students cheer in the streets. Ferdinand? He smiles. He nods. He pretends. Behind the scenes, he's writing to every reactionary monarch in Europe, begging for rescue. They force me to act, he claims. My heart is still with the old order. His letters are soaked in crocodile tears and sealed with holy wax. Historians still debate whether Ferdinand ever truly had a political ideology. Was he a die-hard absolutist? A frightened opportunist? A chameleon in velvet? Most agree. He was a man obsessed with control, not progress. And that obsession leaks into everything. Even his urban policies were dictated by fear. Streetlights were dimmed to prevent nocturnal plotting. Theater performances had to submit scripts in advance. Plays with themes of freedom, choice, or even questionable metaphors were banned. One was pulled because it featured a bird escaping a cage. No joke. Libraries were reduced to 5 categories: saints, monarchs, geography, math, and agriculture. If a book didn't teach you how to obey, count coins, or plant potatoes, it was suspect. And you, walking through this landscape of silent archives and bureaucratic ghosts, begin to feel what Spain must have felt, trapped inside the mind of a man who feared the world more than he loved his people. It's not just that Ferdinand was oppressive. It's that he was so proudly, meticulously oppressive, and so inept while doing it. He didn't build roads. He didn't fund science. He didn't reform the army or modernize agriculture. He didn't even stabilize the currency. Instead, he spent 20 years writing laws about how to think, how to kneel, and how to disappear without leaving a ripple. Now, close the ledger. Step out of the archive. The paper kingdom is crumbling, but its ghosts are still whispering. And Spain? She's about to wake up, but not before one final twist. You wake this time not to bells or screams or marching boots, but to something stranger, a quiet palace, a giggling child, and a woman sighing into a lace handkerchief. This isn't the horror show you've grown used to. Not yet. This is the regency of Maria Cristina, widow of Ferdinand VII, reluctant steward of baby Queen Isabella II, and possibly the most sleep-deprived woman in Europe. Because while Ferdinand is 6 feet under, and let's be honest, still probably clutching his crown, The mess he left behind is now entirely her responsibility. And if you think his ghost would let her rule in peace, you haven't been paying attention. Maria Cristina is trapped in a royal paradox. She must rule as a devout Catholic queen regent for a liberal constitutional monarchy against a conservative rebellion. All while raising a child everyone either wants to worship, manipulate, or assassinate. Oh, and do we mention she has no real power base? She's a walking contradiction. But you follow her now through the antechambers of Madrid's royal palace, where she signs decrees with one hand and rocks a cradle with the other. By 1833, she's already faced threats of poisoning, assassination, and exile. Yet somehow she endures. Let's rewind just a bit. When Ferdinand died, Maria Cristina had to move fast. Don Carlos, the bitter brother, the self-declared Carlos V, was already rallying his forces, backed by conservative clergy, regional traditionalists, and large chunks of the rural nobility. Their argument was simple and terrifying. Spain must be saved from liberal decay. Carlism wasn't just about inheritance. It was a reactionary movement, a pushback against all the reforms, progress, and attempts at modernization that had crept into Spain since the Enlightenment. For them, Isabella was not a queen. She was a symbol of apostasy. And so began the First Carlist War. You've already walked through its earliest fires in Section 7, but now you're entering its full blaze. From 1834 to 1839, this becomes a war of attrition, and Maria Cristina is forced to play chess in a burning cathedral. To survive, she makes a deal with the devil, or rather, with the moderate liberals, known as the moderatos. These are constitutionalists who believe in monarchy but want to restrain it. In exchange for their support, Maria Cristina agrees to accept a revised liberal constitution, grant limited press freedom, and reform local governance. It works sort of. The moderatos help prop her up, but they don't trust her. The radicals think she's a reactionary in disguise. The Carlists think she's the Antichrist. And the military? It supports her for now, but only because there's no better alternative. Here's your mainstream historical fact. During the Regency, the Royal Statute of 1834 was enacted, a half-hearted attempt at a liberal constitution. It created a two-chamber legislature, but the crown still retained major powers. It was, in essence, a political fig leaf. Behind the scenes, Maria Cristina isn't just a queen regent. She's also a scandal. Because in the middle of this war, this regency, this national identity crisis, she remarries. Secretly, to a man named Agustin Fernando Muñoz, a former royal guard and commoner. Yes, a commoner. It's like a Jane Austen subplot wrapped in political dynamite. They fall in love. They marry. Quietly. No grand ceremony. No state announcement. Just a widow and a soldier hiding their affection in palace shadows. Now, here's your quirky tidbit. This marriage produced 8 children. That's right. While Spain is convulsing in civil war, Maria Cristina is running a secret second family inside the royal palace. She juggles governing, plotting, and raising a toddler queen, while sneaking time to breastfeed and hush babies behind embroidered curtains. When the public finds out, fury, absolute fury. The aristocracy is horrified. The church brands her a hypocrite. The Carlists call it proof that the Regency is a sham. Even some liberals turn on her, calling her judgment into question and mocking Muñoz as a nobody in boots. Historians still argue whether Maria Cristina's remarriage weakened her politically beyond repair. Some say it was the final nail. Others insist her real downfall was more systemic. The result of being a woman, a widow, and a regent in a violently divided country. Either way, the walls begin to close in. By 1836, revolution bubbles up again, this time from within the liberal camp. Angry that the Regency continues to resist a full return to the Constitution of 1812, a group of sergeants at the palace of La Grande Mutiny. They seize the Queen Regent and force her, literally at gunpoint, to restore the Constitution. Yes, Maria Cristina, dragged from bed, in her nightgown, signs the document with trembling hands while soldiers chant in the courtyard. The image is surreal, like a fever dream of the French Revolution playing out in miniature. But she signs, and in that moment, Spain shifts again. You feel it. Another axis turn, another loop closing, another legacy rewriting itself under duress. With the 1812 Constitution restored, Spain officially becomes a constitutional monarchy again. Parliament returns. The press flourishes. Freemasons meet in basements. Liberal clubs open in major cities. And Maria Cristina? She fades. By 1840, the pressure is too much. With public trust gone, war fatigue mounting, and political enemies everywhere, she abdicates the regency and flees to France with Muñoz and her children. She will never rule again. Now, Spain belongs to the liberals and to Isabella II, still only 10 years old. But you know what happens when Spain is ruled by a child with no clear regent and a parliament full of knife-fighting politicians? Yes, another power vacuum. Enter General Baldomero Espartero, hero of the Carlist War, military genius, and liberal strongman. Parliament appoints him regent, but Espartero is no smoother than Ferdinand. He governs with the subtlety of a cannon, forcing reforms, exiling opponents, and alienating everyone from landowners to factory workers. Riots erupt. Soldiers mutiny. Carlist cells begin whispering again. Maria Cristina watches from Paris, sipping coffee and muttering, "Told you so." And Isabella? Still a pawn. She's paraded through events, dressed in frilly gowns, taught Latin and embroidery, while ministers scream in adjacent rooms. She learns to smile at generals and curtsy before priests. But behind her eyes, something sharp is forming. A hunger, a will. And you, watching from the wings, realize something chilling. Ferdinand VII is gone, but his echo still rules. Every choice, every purge, every contradiction, it all comes back to his reign. He didn't just shape the present. He trapped it, like amber around an insect. Spain will claw forward, but the poison he planted, it's still blooming. The morning fog over Madrid is heavy, stubborn, and oddly symbolic, as if the entire country is still trying to blink the last few decades out of its eyes. But the stage is changing. Ferdinand is long gone. Maria Cristina is sipping tea in Paris, surrounded by her Muñoz babies. Espartero, the overzealous regent general, is in and out of favor like a badly tuned violin. And in the midst of all this political chaos, Isabella II turns 13. And the Spanish Parliament? They do something absolutely no one expects. They declare her of age. 13 years old. Too young to vote. Too young to marry. Too young to sign a contract. But apparently old enough to wear the crown. You watch the coronation unfold like a velvet pantomime. Ministers beaming, generals saluting, bishops blessing her with trembling hands. And Isabella? She stands awkwardly in heels too large for her, wearing a crown that still smells faintly of Ferdinand's sweat and fear. Her smile is small, controlled, practiced, because she knows probably better than anyone, this crown is cursed. She didn't ask for it, didn't choose it, but it's hers now, and everyone around her has expectations. The liberals want her to modernize. The moderates want her to play nice. The Carlists want her erased. The church wants her obedient. And the military? The military wants a paycheck. This is Isabella's Spain now, and it's more fractured than ever. Let's begin with your mainstream historical fact. Isabella II's reign, from 1843 to 1868, is often described as one of the most unstable periods in Spanish history. During these 25 years, over 60 different governments will rise and fall. That's a new government every 5 months. Yes, really. You'd get more political consistency from a weather vane in a hurricane. And it begins almost immediately. Within her first few years as queen, Isabella becomes a political football kicked between two rival liberal factions, the Moderados and the Progresistas. The Moderados, less liberal, more aristocratic, try to shape her into a pliant monarch. The Progresistas, meanwhile, push for stronger constitutional limits and broader reform. What does Isabella want? Well, she's a teenager. She wants dresses, parties, some measure of peace, and maybe, just maybe, not to be the human shield between two ideological flamethrowers. But the court doesn't allow that. At 15, they force her to marry her cousin, Francisco de Assis, Duke of Cadiz, a man so widely mocked and poorly regarded that even Isabella is said to have burst into tears when the match was announced. He's sickly, stiff, effeminate, and depending on which diary you believe, possibly gay. Rumors swirl that the marriage is never consummated, or that Isabella has to be bribed into the wedding chamber. Their relationship becomes palace legend. They barely speak. They sleep in separate rooms. And Isabella begins taking lovers. Many lovers. Now, here's your quirky tidbit of the section. One popular street rhyme about the royal marriage went, Isabella has a man for a husband, but not for a king. He's more into lace than state affairs. Yes, the Spanish people turned her personal life into musical theater. And yet, the monarchy trudges on. Isabella bears children, at least 4 of them. Their paternity is widely debated. Some say her lover, General Serrano, fathered the heir. Others point to the handsome opera singer-turned-duke who often visited the palace at midnight. But officially, they're all Francisco's children. This scandalous aura makes Isabella both more relatable to the people and more despised by the elite. Now let's zoom out. During her reign, Spain undergoes whiplash-inducing political shifts. Military coups, many revolutions, civil unrest. Governments rise and collapse like sandcastles in a rainstorm. Each new cabinet promises reform, unity, strength. Each lasts barely a year. You stand in the Parliament gallery and watch a surreal political ballet. Men shouting, papers flying, alliances forming and breaking over lunch. No one trusts anyone. Everyone wants a piece of the crown, but not the responsibility. Isabella tries to rule through it all, but her credibility is constantly undermined by scandal, incompetence, and a mounting sense that the monarchy is broken beyond repair. And here's where you begin to feel Ferdinand's shadow again. Because every time Isabella tries to stabilize the monarchy, she's forced to draw from the well her father poisoned. Absolutist instincts, reactionary advisors, royal entitlement. Even as she tries to play the constitutional game, she increasingly falls back on palace intrigue and favoritism. She reinstates old allies of her mother. She protects corrupt ministers. She squashes freedom of the press when headlines get too personal. At one point, she dissolves parliament altogether and rules by decree for months. Historians still argue whether she was a tyrant or just trapped. Some say she inherited her father's paranoia. Others argue she simply couldn't escape the system he built. Either way, the result is the same, mounting resentment. By the 1860s, the resentment reaches a boiling point. The economy slumps. The army is unpaid. The provinces rebel. And in the summer of 1868, a coalition of disgruntled generals, liberals, Republicans, and even monarchists who just really want her gone rise up in a movement known as La Gloriosa, the Glorious Revolution. They issue proclamations. They march. They demand reform. Isabella? She flees. No dramatic speeches. No last stand. She boards a train and leaves Spain, exiled to France like her mother before her. It's almost poetic in a deeply dysfunctional family kind of way. And just like that, the Bourbon monarchy ends for now. Spain becomes a constitutional monarchy without a monarch, then a short-lived republic, then a mess of rotating kings and generals until another Bourbon eventually returns. Spoiler, it'll be her son, Alfonso XII. But for Isabella, the dream is over. You find her years later, living quietly in Paris. Overweight, bored, bitter, sipping chocolate, and muttering in Spanish to herself. She writes letters to her children. Sometimes she jokes about returning. Sometimes she doesn't. She dies in 1904. Few notice, fewer care, and yet, none of it would have happened without Ferdinand. His legacy was a machine of dysfunction, handed down like a cursed heirloom. The constitutional chaos, the military coups, the pendulum politics of 19th century Spain, they all grew from the soil he scorched. So when you hear people whisper about the bad Bourbon blood, remember, they're not really talking about Isabella. They're talking about her father. You wake now not to the creaking of palace floors or the rustle of velvet court robes, but to a curious emptiness. Spain in the 1870s is a country in between things, between kings, between systems, between one nervous breakdown and the next. It's as if the very concept of monarchy has been wrapped in burlap, tossed into a storage room, and left to ferment. Isabella II is gone, exiled, eating pastries in Paris. The Bourbons are out. But what comes next? Spain isn't sure. It's like a nation on a blind date with democracy, but still texting its ex. You look around. The throne is vacant. The crown sits untouched. And everyone, liberals, Republicans, Carlists, generals, even curious foreign powers, is circling, trying to figure out who, if anyone, deserves to sit in Ferdinand VII's moldy chair. Because what Ferdinand left behind wasn't a dynasty. It was a haunted vacancy. Let's start with what happens immediately after Isabella's fall in 1868. Spain tries to become a modern constitutional monarchy. A real one this time. With accountability. With reforms. With someone who didn't grow up being told their bloodline was holy. This is your mainstream historical fact. In 1870, after considerable bickering and an international search that honestly resembled a reality TV show for royals, Spain settles on Amadeo of Savoy, the second son of Italy's king, Victor Emmanuel II. Yes, Spain imports a monarch, like a fine wine or a high-maintenance rescue dog. Amadeo is young, liberal-minded, reasonably handsome, and, most importantly, not a Bourbon. Parliament thinks that's a selling point. But from the moment his train pulls into Madrid, things go wrong. On the day of his arrival, his strongest political backer, General Juan Prim, is assassinated. Shot 3 times in the street. Bleeds out slowly. By the time Amadeo meets the cabinet, he's already down one key supporter and 50% of his confidence. The Spanish people? They greet him with confusion, suspicion, and in some cases, outright jeers. Who is this Italian with a funny accent and no divine right? Why should Spain, battered and bitter, bend the knee to a king whose only qualification seems to be not being Isabella's cousin? The military doesn't trust him. The clergy resents him. The Carlists, predictably, denounce him as illegitimate. And the Republicans, well, they just want him gone. So begins Amadeo's spectacularly cursed reign. You follow him through his royal schedule. Public appearances interrupted by protests, laws rejected by deadlocked parliaments, riots blooming overnight in half a dozen cities. At one point, even his own royal guards mutiny. He has to walk through a gauntlet of angry soldiers just to reach his carriage. Here's your quirky tidbit. One Spanish newspaper mockingly referred to Amadeo as El Rey Turista, the tourist king, because of his foreign manners and complete lack of traction in Spanish society. Another described his rule as a honeymoon in hell. By 1873, Amadeo has had enough. He gives a speech in front of Parliament, equal parts farewell and sigh, and abdicates, declaring the Spanish people ungovernable. He gets back on a train and vanishes into the mist, leaving Spain exactly as he found it, broken, crownless, and covered in mud. So what does Spain do next? It becomes a republic, for the first time in modern history. The First Spanish Republic is declared with a mix of optimism and panic. Flags wave, bells ring, intellectuals toast champagne, radical newspapers declare a new dawn. But then, Spain remembers its Spain. Within the first year, the Republic has 5 different presidents. Yes, 5. One quits over the budget. One resigns after being shot. One flees the country. Another dissolves parliament and then gets arrested by his own guards. Local governments declare independence. Entire regions attempt to secede. The Republic has to fight actual wars just to keep itself from crumbling. The South declares a cantonalist revolution. Imagine dozens of little city-states all claiming they're the true republic. It's like herding revolutionary cats with muskets. Meanwhile, guess who comes back from the shadows? The Carlists. They surge again, igniting the Third Carlist War in 1872. Don Carlos, another one, this time the grandson of the original, declares himself rightful king and leads a full-scale uprising in the north. It's like the 1830s all over again, but but with better rifles and worse logistics. Historians still argue whether the First Republic failed because it was unprepared or because Spain simply wasn't ready to govern itself. Some say the Republic was doomed by infighting. Others point to sabotage by monarchists and military loyalists. Either way, by 1874, the whole experiment implodes. And into that vacuum steps the ghost of Ferdinand, in the form of his grandson. Because here comes Alfonso XII, the son of Isabella II, Bourbon blood and all, now grown, groomed, and brought back from exile. The military, exhausted from wars and coups, throws its support behind him. The people, sick of instability, mostly shrug and accept. And thus, the Bourbon Restoration begins. Now here's where it gets weirdly poetic. Alfonso XII is everything his grandfather was not. Calm, reasonable, constitutionally inclined. He genuinely wants to modernize. He understands compromise. He speaks softly, smiles easily, and has no illusions of divine power. And for a while, it works. The new monarchy, starting in 1874, establishes a two-party system, alternating power between the conservatives and liberals through what's known as the Turno Pacifico, the peaceful turn. It's a managed democracy, rigged in subtle ways, but it provides stability. Spain enters a goldenish period of recovery. But you can't help but notice. Every reform, every constitution, every new idea, they're all responses to Ferdinand's failures. A monarchy humbled, a people exhausted, a system too traumatized to swing too far in any direction. This is Ferdinand's true legacy. Not statues, not poems, not devotion, but a haunted political consciousness passed down like a hereditary disease. His obsession with control created a nation allergic to authority. His censorship made freedom of speech a war cry. His paranoia built the surveillance state. His policies made radicals of moderates. His refusal to share power made Spain's attempt at democracy feel like a slow, reluctant detox. Now, before we leave this chapter, remember this final echo. The Restoration may feel like a new era, but its bones are still Bourbon. The trauma is still there. The people may cheer Alfonso XII, but they also remember. They remember the toad-faced king who outlawed laughter. They remember the marriages, the Carlists, the burned constitutions, and the child queen dragged through the mud. And they whisper, because in Spain, the future is never free from its past. You awaken, this time not in a palace, nor on a battlefield, nor among bickering ministers, but at a dinner table in a respectable, lace-curtained Madrid townhouse in 1885. There's soft violin music playing. The roast lamb smells exquisite. Someone is reading aloud from a conservative newspaper. And for the first time in generations, no one is panicking. This is what peace looks like in Spain. Manufactured, measured, managed. Alfonso XII is on the throne. And while the country isn't thriving, it has stopped actively eating itself. There's bread in the markets. The generals are content. Parliament still lies to itself, but it does so politely. And over it all, like wallpaper you can't strip, the legacy of Ferdinand VII remains quietly embedded in everything. This period, the Restauración or Restoration, is Spain's great attempt to reset the monarchy. After decades of uprisings, exiles, and failed experiments in republicanism, the elites decide they'd rather deal with a well-behaved Bourbon than risk another revolution. So they dust off the crown, polish up the Constitution, and place it on Alfonso XII's carefully parted head. Here's your mainstream historical fact. The Spanish Constitution of 1876, enacted under Alfonso XII, re-established a constitutional monarchy with a bicameral legislature and nominal civil liberties. But the elections? Those were often fixed through a system called caciquismo, local bosses guaranteeing results through bribes, threats, and backroom handshakes. You walk the halls of the Cortes, Spain's parliament, and it feels scripted. Members stand, speak, sit, vote on cue. The two ruling parties, the liberals and conservatives, alternate power every few years like ballroom partners. This isn't democracy, it's turn-based monarchy. But the people accept it. Why? Because they're tired. Decades of Ferdinand's tyranny, Isabella's scandals, Amadeo's confusion, and the First Republic's chaos have left the country politically exhausted. What Spain needs now is not innovation. It's a functioning facade. And the Restoration provides exactly that. But look a little deeper. Beneath the chandeliers and constitutional preambles, you'll see the real legacy Ferdinand left. Because Spain still doesn't trust itself. Take the military. They no longer run the government directly, but they're watching. Always watching. Ferdinand's decades of empowering generals as political tools means the officer class remains deeply entangled in civilian rule. Every prime minister knows. Anger the army, and you might not wake up in office. Take the church. Ferdinand made it a political instrument, and it still behaves like one. Catholicism remains tightly bound to the state. Religious orders run schools, hospitals, newspapers. The 1876 Constitution guarantees religious freedom, technically, but in practice, you're Catholic or you're silent. Even the idea of liberalism is haunted. The word has been bent out of shape. Liberals now are landowning aristocrats in tailored suits, debating reforms no one intends to implement. True radicals have either gone underground, fled, or been jailed for inciting unrest by quoting Rousseau too loudly. Now, here's your quirky tidbit. During the 1880s, it becomes fashionable for elite families to host historical dinner parties, where guests role-play as famous Spanish monarchs. Ferdinand VII is often portrayed as a cartoonish villain. Stuffed cheeks, trembling hands, barking orders for more pudding. People laugh. They drink. But the satire barely hides the discomfort. You visit one such party. A mustachioed banker, dressed as Ferdinand, declares, "No freedoms after fish," and everyone roars with laughter. But behind their eyes, they remember, he really did think like that. So where is Alfonso XII in all of this? He's trying. Honestly, he supports education reforms, improves infrastructure, and works hard to balance conservative and liberal factions. But he's only one man, and the system he inherited, rooted in Ferdinand's century of trauma, is not easily softened. Then, in 1885, he dies. Tuberculosis. Age 27. No warning. No plan. The nation holds its breath. Again. But this time, things don't collapse. Because his wife, Maria Christina of Austria, is pregnant. And the country waits, nervously, anxiously, to see if the child will be a boy. It is. And so begins the regency of Maria Christina, echoing the one held by her namesake half a century earlier. But this time, it's not war and purges. It's bureaucracy, middle-class expansion, and strategic caution. Spain is holding itself together with parchment and patience. You walk through Madrid and see signs of life. Electric trams, modern cafes, public lectures. There's a sense that Spain is finally catching up to the rest of Europe. But don't get too comfortable, because Ferdinand's ghost is still whispering in the provinces. In Catalonia, in Basque Country, in Andalusia, regional identity movements are stirring. Ferdinand's centralization policies tried to crush local autonomy. Now people want it back, with flags, parades, and printed manifestos. In the colonies, unrest is boiling. Ferdinand's loss of Spanish America still burns in the national psyche. And now, Cuba, the Philippines, and Puerto Rico are simmering with anti-colonial sentiment. Spanish officers mutter about discipline. Local newspapers talk of independence. Historians still argue whether the Restoration was truly a new beginning or just a prettier mask on the same old Bourbon face. Some say Alfonso XII offered Spain a genuine path forward. Others insist it was all stagecraft, an illusion of order that couldn't survive a proper storm. But one thing is clear. The roots of Spain's modern identity crisis still dig deep into Ferdinand's reign. His war on progress made modernization a foreign concept. His glorification of monarchy made constitutional reform feel treasonous. His hatred of compromise taught generations to govern by force or fraud. Even in this seemingly peaceful moment, you feel it, like a hidden fault line under cobbled streets. And so, As you sip warm coffee at a newsstand in 1887, reading about a labor strike in Barcelona, or an anarchist cell broken up in Seville, or whispers of rebellion in Cuba. You know, Spain isn't healed. It's just holding its breath. You open your eyes to a sunrise blooming over 1890 Spain. Golden light bouncing off iron railways, smokestacks, and telegraph lines. From a distance, the country finally looks like it belongs in the modern world. But as you step closer, you can already feel the tension pulsing under the polished veneer. This is a country on edge. Not rioting yet, not collapsing, just vibrating like a teacup balancing on a windowsill during an earthquake that hasn't hit yet. The baby king, Alfonso XIII, is technically on the throne now, but only on paper. His mother, Maria Cristina of Austria, still rules as regent. She's rigid, cautious, and famously discreet, playing her cards so close to her chest that entire ministries rise and fall before she lifts an eyebrow. And in the shadows, Ferdinand VII's ghost continues its tour, uninvited but ever-present. Because by now, his legacy has evolved. It's no longer just about politics or censorship or who gets to wear a crown. It's institutionalized nervousness. Spain is governed not by bold visionaries, but by men who tiptoe through rooms, afraid to open any door too wide. And then, boom, the first tremor hits. The year is 1895. The colony of Cuba, still a jewel in Spain's shrinking imperial crown, erupts in open revolt. You remember Ferdinand's colonial losses in the Americas, how he fumbled the independence movements with arrogance and indecision. Now, you watch his ghost flinch as history repeats itself. Spain once again faces a war of independence, but this time, the world is watching. This is your mainstream historical fact. The Cuban War of Independence, 1895 to 1898, became the flashpoint for the Spanish-American War, which would ultimately see Spain lose Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. It marked the final collapse of the Spanish Empire, and it begins, yet again, with indecision. The Spanish government, still operating under Ferdinand-style caution and posturing, responds with outdated military tactics and underfunded troops. They send General Valeriano Weyler, who institutes brutal concentration policies, rounding up civilians into camps to isolate rebel fighters. The strategy backfires spectacularly. Thousands of Cubans die of disease and starvation. International outcry grows. American journalists, eager to sell papers, push a sensationalist narrative, yellow journalism, at its most dramatic. And over in Washington, the United States, now flexing its own imperial muscles, sees an opportunity. When a USS Maine explodes in Havana Harbor in 1898, under still debated circumstances, the U.S. declares war. Spain, exhausted and underprepared, stumbles into battle and loses. Badly, spectacularly, pathetically. In just a few months, Spain's 400-year-old empire collapses like a house made of wet paper. Here's your quirky tidbit. When news of the defeat reached Madrid, some aristocrats reportedly hid their Spanish flags so they wouldn't be associated with national humiliation. Others sewed black ribbons onto them, like mourning armbands for an empire that no longer existed. You feel it in the cafes and cigar parlors, the dusty libraries and cracked cathedrals, the deep psychic wound of 1898. It's known today as the disaster of 98 or El Disaster. And Spain doesn't just lose colonies, it loses confidence. For the first time, people begin asking not just who should rule, but whether Spain even knows what it is anymore. This triggers an entire movement of intellectuals and artists known as the Generation of 98, who wander the country with notebooks, writing poetry, philosophy, and bitter essays trying to answer one question. What went wrong? Was it the monarchy? Was it Catholicism? Was it the failure to industrialize? Or was it something deeper? A soul wound passed down from kings like Ferdinand, who taught Spain to fear change and worship empty tradition. Historians still argue whether Spain could have modernized earlier if Ferdinand hadn't reversed the Constitution of 1812 or crushed intellectualism or treated colonial crises like court dramas. Some say the loss of the empire was inevitable. Others believe Ferdinand's choices delayed Spain's reckoning by nearly a century. Now, the monarchy tries damage control. Maria Cristina clings to power as regent, but her influence is fading. The young king, Alfonso XIII, is growing up fast, smart, stubborn, and unfortunately eager to get involved in politics before he understands how badly they work. He starts sitting in on cabinet meetings. He interrupts generals. He makes offhand comments that spark diplomatic confusion. And people begin to worry. Have we created another Ferdinand? Only this one rides bicycles and thinks colonialism is still cool. Meanwhile, Spain itself is splintering again. The regions stir. Catalan nationalism rises, fueled by economic success and cultural pride. The Basques, long suppressed, start talking about autonomy. And in Andalusia, anarchists hand out leaflets next to goat carts, preaching about land redistribution and the failures of the crown. Even within the army, cracks are showing. You remember how Ferdinand created a politicized officer class. Now, those same structures come back to haunt the monarchy. Generals no longer take orders from parliament. They have expectations. They believe they are the backbone of the nation, the true guardians of order. And they're watching Alfonso XIII with a very skeptical eye. You walk through a military barracks in Zaragoza and hear mutterings. Officers joke about whether the king will be strong enough to handle the rabble. But underneath the humor, there's a dangerous nostalgia for dictatorship, for iron-fisted rule, for a version of Ferdinand that got things done. One officer even keeps a portrait of Ferdinand VII in his office. You stare at it. Dusty, faded, but unmistakable. The ghost is still here. Now, as you drift through the last years of the 19th century, Spain feels hollowed out. The empire is gone. The monarchy is weak. The people are disillusioned. Intellectuals debate whether Spain is a real country or a tragic performance art project with flags. And you can't help but think, this wasn't just bad luck. It was built by decisions made decades ago in candlelit rooms, where Ferdinand VII scratched his name onto decrees that declared war on the future. He didn't just ruin his own reign. He cursed the next 100 years. And as the 20th century approaches, fast, loud, industrial, ideological, Spain is not ready. The modern world is banging on the door, and no one seems to know whether to open it or hide under the table. The year is 1902, and you're back in the royal palace. Not the brooding, fire-lit lair of Ferdinand VII with its Baroque gold filigree and stiff ceremonial airs, but something lighter, newer, almost nervous in its luxury. The furniture gleams, the uniforms sparkle, and standing dead center beneath the chandeliers is Alfonso XIII, just 16 years old, wearing a ceremonial sash that might as well be a leash. Spain has decided he's ready to rule, ready to carry the weight of empire, monarchy, Catholicism, the military, and 200 years of contradiction. Never mind that he still writes his name with a bit too much flourish and once mistook a liberal deputy for the palace gardener. He's king now. And as always, Ferdinand's long shadow stretches into the throne room. Alfonso XIII is tall, charming, athletic, even kind of cool for a king. He speaks multiple languages, enjoys fencing, and rides horses like he was born in the saddle. The newspapers call him El Rey Caballero, the gentleman king. To foreign dignitaries, he's a walking PR campaign. Look, Spain isn't broken anymore. Look how mature our teenager is. But you, standing just behind him, watching the crown lowered onto his head, know the truth. The rod is still there. You see it in the way generals linger just a little too long at cabinet meetings, still expecting their words to carry more weight than laws. You hear it in the priests who grumble about modern education, still longing for the days when Ferdinand let them control minds from the pulpit. And you read it in the newspapers, editorials worried that this young king might fall into the same old traps. Spoiler, he does. Let's begin with your mainstream historical fact. Alfonso XI's reign, 1902 to 1931, would become one of the most turbulent in Spain's modern history, spanning two military dictatorships, one catastrophic war in Morocco, a global pandemic, a failed democracy, and finally the collapse of the monarchy itself. Yeah, buckle up. At first, Alfonso tries to play the constitutional game. He lets the two main parties, conservatives and liberals, continue their alternation of power, the so-called Turno Pacifico. But he's already interfering behind the scenes. He manipulates appointments. He favors military leaders. And worst of all, he can't resist meddling in North Africa. Yes, Morocco, Spain's last shot at colonial relevance. The country has already lost its empire. Cuba, the Philippines, Puerto Rico gone. But now, in the early 1900s, European powers are slicing Africa like a birthday cake, and Spain wants a piece. So Alfonso supports a military occupation of northern Morocco, carving out a Spanish protectorate alongside the French. And from the moment Spanish boots touch Moroccan soil, everything falls apart. Corrupt officers, under-equipped troops, fierce local resistance. The war becomes a bloody mess, draining Spain's budget and morale. Young conscripts die by the thousands, while generals hold dinner parties back in Madrid. Then comes Annual, 1921, the Battle of Annual. Here's your quirky tidbit. It's considered one of the worst military defeats in modern European history. An entire Spanish force is ambushed and annihilated by Riffian guerrillas. Over 10,000 men die, often after surrendering. Bodies are mutilated, heads are displayed on spikes, and the general in charge runs away and survives. You stand at the docks as the survivors return, hollow-eyed, limping, whispering about betrayals, incompetence, and madness. The Spanish people are furious, and Alfonso, he does the worst possible thing. Instead of holding the military accountable, he protects them. He pressures the courts to shelve the investigation. He praises the army. He refuses to apologize. It's Ferdinand VII 2.0, loyalty to generals over justice, stability over truth. Historians still argue whether Alfonso was trying to maintain institutional balance or simply too spineless to confront the army. Some say he feared a coup. Others claim he truly believed the Moroccan War was noble. Either way, his decision shatters public faith in the monarchy. The middle class turns on him. Republicans gain traction. Socialists and anarchists take to the streets. The labor movement grows teeth. And in Barcelona, Catalan nationalists begin openly calling for independence. Meanwhile, the church, once his greatest ally, grows anxious. Alfonso had promised to protect Catholic values, but his court is increasingly seen as hedonistic. Affairs, gambling, and scandals pile up. And now for the royal gossip you didn't ask for, but definitely deserve. Your lightly salacious fact. Alfonso XIII was an avid consumer of early pornography and even helped finance some risque films. Yes, the King of Spain moonlighted as an investor in adult cinema. Copies of his personal stash still exist, preserved in film archives under lock and key. You think Ferdinand would have been horrified? Nah, he probably would have taken notes. But Spain is no longer just a playground for kings. Ideologies are on the march. Across Europe, monarchies are collapsing. World War I left millions dead and governments reeling. Even though Spain stayed neutral in the war, it couldn't avoid the aftershocks. Economic downturn, inflation, and rising extremism. By the 1920s, the monarchy is a house made of newspaper, crumbling under the weight of history. So what happens? A general steps in. Sound familiar? In 1923, Miguel Primo de Rivera, a portly officer with a handlebar mustache and a deep distrust of democracy, stages a military coup. He abolishes the Constitution, suspends Parliament, and establishes a dictatorship with Alfonso's blessing. Yes, the king approves it. The logic? Stability. Order. Efficiency. And for a few years, it kind of works. Roads are built. The currency stabilizes. The Moroccan War is finally settled. The streets are calmer. But the cost? Democracy dies. Freedom of the press is muzzled. Political opposition is jailed. Local languages and cultures are suppressed. The entire apparatus of the state becomes a mirror of Ferdinand's absolutism, but modernized with trains and better fonts. Eventually, Even Primo de Rivera wears out his welcome. By 1930, the economy tanks and his support evaporates. He resigns and dies in exile. The monarchy tries to walk back into democracy like nothing happened. But the Spanish people aren't buying it. They remember the war, the betrayals, the porn, the dictatorship. They remember Ferdinand, even if they don't say his name. And so, in 1931, municipal elections become a de facto referendum on the monarchy. The results? Republicans win. Everywhere. Alfonso XIII reads the room. He quietly packs a suitcase, kisses his family goodbye, and leaves the country, never formally abdicating, but knowing full well that the game is over. And with that, the Second Spanish Republic is born. No more kings. No more sash-wearing teenagers with imperial delusions. For the first time, Spain seems serious about democracy. But you, still perched in the rafters of history, can't help but feel anxious. Because this isn't the end of the story. This is the part where the ghosts of monarchs past begin to scream. You emerge now into the noise and sunlight of 1931, just as the Spanish flag is being pulled down from the royal palace and replaced with a tricolor banner. Red, yellow, and purple. It flaps defiantly in the wind, like a freshly laundered bed sheet of rebellion. Crowds cheer. Hats fly. Republicans dance in the streets. Spain is no longer a monarchy. The Second Spanish Republic has arrived. For the first time in centuries, there's no king, no queen, no royal decree. Just an earnest, fragile hope that maybe, finally, Spain can govern itself like a modern nation. Intellectuals beam. Artists drink until they see double. Farmers sing protest songs in rhythm with their plows. And you? You look over your shoulder where Ferdinand VII's ghost twitches. He's not gone. Not yet. His fingerprints still coat every institution. His paranoia is preserved in the archives. His disdain for the Constitution still haunts conservative editorials. You can hear his echo in the speeches of generals who called democracy a dangerous luxury. But right now, Spain is trying to exorcise him. Let's begin with your mainstream historical fact. The Second Spanish Republic, 1931 to 1939, was a bold, progressive, and deeply polarizing attempt to establish a secular, democratic, and egalitarian Spain. It introduced sweeping reforms: education, land redistribution, women's suffrage, secularism, and provoked immediate, furious backlash from conservatives, monarchists, the military, and the church. You walk through the Parliament building, now buzzing with new energy. Young deputies shout over each other in modern Spanish, waving manifestos and quoting Rousseau like it's jazz. The new constitution is radical for its time. It separates church and state, bans the monarchy, legalizes divorce, grants women the right to vote. For a moment, just a moment, it feels like Spain might actually catch up with the 20th century. But remember, Spain is not a blank slate. It's a traumatized empire in recovery, trying to walk on legs broken by generations of Bourbon rule. Ferdinand's legacy isn't just statues and lost wars. It's mistrust, rage, and cultural fragmentation, the kind you can't fix with parliamentary speeches or nicely worded legislation. So the backlash begins almost instantly. The Catholic Church, which Ferdinand had once turned into a political enforcer, now feels humiliated. Priests are stripped of their state salaries. Religious orders lose control of schools. And conservative Spaniards, especially in the countryside, feel like their world is being deliberately dismantled. The military grumbles too. Ferdinand's old policy of empowering generals to play kingmaker has left behind a deeply politicized officer class. Now they sit in cafes, sipping bitter wine, talking about honor and plotting revenge. And then there are the monarchists. They may have lost the throne, but they haven't lost their money or their connections. Old aristocratic families still hold vast estates. They finance newspapers, support clandestine political clubs, and whisper about restoring order when the time is right. Meanwhile, the anarchists and socialists are not exactly making things easier. They're ecstatic about the Republic, but many believe it's not moving fast enough. In cities like Barcelona and Zaragoza, strikes escalate into riots. Police clash with demonstrators. Churches are torched. Symbols of the old regime are defaced. You stand in the middle of a public square and watch it happen. Ideals crumbling under pressure. Now, here's your quirky tidbit. In 1931, shortly after the Republic was proclaimed, several cities renamed their streets en masse. One Spanish town literally renamed every single street after a different leftist philosopher. A police station ended up located on Bakunin Street. The Postal Service had a nervous breakdown. Meanwhile, women step into the light. Clara Campoamor, a fierce Republican deputy, delivers a speech so passionate, so precise, that Spain becomes one of the first countries in Europe to grant women full suffrage, years ahead of France and Italy. You walk with her down the marble steps of Parliament, where reporters shout questions and old men frown from their carriages. It's progress. Genuine, courageous progress. But it's not enough, because Spain has never been allowed to evolve slowly. Ferdinand's legacy taught the nation that political transitions must be absolute, scorched earth, all or nothing. There's no room for moderation, no patience for compromise. The center collapses. Extremes take over. By 1934, the Republic is in crisis. Conservative forces, terrified of rising socialism, seize power within the parliament. Reforms are frozen. Priests return to schools. Censorship creeps back in. The response? A leftist uprising, particularly in Asturias, where workers take over entire cities and declare a socialist commune. The army is sent in. Artillery shells apartment buildings. Over 1,000 are killed. The streets are soaked not just in blood, but in ideological despair. Ferdinand would have nodded in approval. Divide, suppress, survive. Historians still argue whether the Republic was doomed from the start or simply too ambitious, too fragile, too surrounded by wolves. Some say the reforms moved too fast. Others say they didn't go far enough. But almost everyone agrees. Spain was hurtling toward civil war. And the last straw, 1936, a new leftist coalition, the Popular Front, wins national elections. They promise to restart reforms, redistribute land, and reduce military influence. The right, convinced this is the beginning of a communist dictatorship, panics. In July, military officers led by Francisco Franco launch a coup. Not a small rebellion, not a protest, a full-blown civil war. Ferdinand's model, once again, returns from the grave. Crush opposition, restore order, save Spain from itself. Only now, the generals wear modern uniforms. Their weapons come from Nazi Germany and fascist Italy. Their vision? A return to a strong, Catholic, hierarchical Spain where kings, or someone like a king, rule without question. The Republic fights back. Brave, desperate, divided. International brigades of volunteers pour in, poets, students, idealists. George Orwell writes from the trenches. Pablo Picasso paints Guernica, a canvas dripping in grief and fire. But it's not enough. After 3 brutal years, Franco wins, and Spain falls. Not in a monarchy, but something eerily similar, a military dictatorship wrapped in royal nostalgia. The Republic is dead. Alfonso XIII, still alive in exile, probably feels vindicated. But Spain doesn't crown a new Bourbon. Not yet. Instead, it slips into a darkness that Ferdinand himself would have understood perfectly. Surveillance, censorship, exile, fear. And you step into that silence, haunted by the same question everyone in Spain now whispers. What if we cut out the rot when we had the chance? You step into 1940s Spain like someone entering a mausoleum. The walls are whitewashed, the windows shuttered, and every conversation carries a hidden echo. Street names have changed. The flags are new. But if you listen carefully, just beneath the Catholic hymns and marching boots, you can hear him. Ferdinand VII, humming softly in the wiring of a dictatorship. Because even though he's been dead for over a century, Spain's newest ruler, General Francisco Franco, is playing Ferdinand's greatest hits on repeat. Franco calls himself El Caudillo, the leader. Not king, not president, just the man. A military victor, a Catholic patriarch, a reactionary savior. And what he builds after the Spanish Civil War, 1936 to 1939, is not just a dictatorship. It's a Frankenstein monarchy, stitched together from the worst parts of Ferdinand's royal playbook, but with modern uniforms and darker consequences. Let's begin with your mainstream historical fact. From 1939 to 1975, Franco ruled Spain as a military dictator. His regime fused ultra-Catholic nationalism, fascist aesthetics, censorship, and deep political repression. There were no free elections, no free press, and dissenters were imprisoned, exiled, or executed. And all this under the guise of stability. You walk through Madrid and see a city rebuilt not with joy, but with fear. People speak in hushed tones. Priests bless portraits of Franco as if he were saint. Children are taught a version of Spanish history where Ferdinand was misunderstood, Isabella was a heroine, and liberalism is code for chaos. And guess what? Franco loved Ferdinand, not just admired, emulated. He once referred to Ferdinand's reign as a time of unity and strength. You find his personal diaries sprinkled with wistful references to the glory of past kings who knew how to silence discord. He saw Ferdinand's war on the Constitution as an act of patriotism, a restoration of order. And so, Franco sets out to perfect that system. Political parties? Outlawed. Labor unions? Banned. The press? Censored to the point where journalists must submit articles in triplicate. One for the editor, one for the censor, one for the shredder. Religion? Mandatory. Not just encouraged, enforced. Children begin their school days with Catholic prayers and end them with songs of military valor. You remember how Ferdinand relied on priests to control the minds of the masses? Franco upgrades the system. He gives the church co-governance over morality. Divorce is illegal. Homosexuality is criminalized. Even reading certain novels can get you arrested. Here's your quirky tidbit. One of Franco's most feared censorship rules forbade women from appearing on television without sleeves. Yes, no sleeveless dresses, even on scorching days, because modesty must triumph. Ferdinand would have sighed happily into his wine glass. But unlike Ferdinand, Franco understands optics. He modernizes the economy, just enough to keep the world from laughing. He builds infrastructure. He let Spain join the UN in the 1950s. He flirts with capitalism, invites tourism, and allows Coca-Cola to enter Spanish shops. But behind that shiny surface, repression remains absolute. And what about the monarchy? Here's the twist. Franco doesn't restore the monarchy immediately. He knows the people are still bitter. So instead, he parks the throne like a vintage car in a garage. Not gone, just waiting. But in 1947, he makes a move straight from Ferdinand's playbook. He passes a law declaring Spain a kingdom, again, without a king. Think about that. Spain becomes a monarchy in theory, but with a general instead of a monarch. It's like naming a ghost president of your club and insisting he still makes the rules. Historians still argue whether this was pure nostalgia or a clever trap. Some say Franco wanted to co-opt the legitimacy of monarchy without surrendering any control. Others believe he always planned to crown someone he could control. And that someone? Juan Carlos I, son of Alfonso XIII, grandson of the man who fled in 1931. A Bourbon, but a Franco-trained Bourbon. You see, Franco doesn't trust the old royal line. So he plucks young Juan Carlos from exile, brings him to Spain, and begins grooming him like a prize-winning show dog. The boy studies under fascist tutors, learns the proper blend of Catholic virtue and military loyalty. And above all, he learns to obey. Juan Carlos is polite, unassuming, bland even. Franco likes that. In his mind, Juan Carlos will one day inherit a throne shackled to dictatorship, keeping Franco's vision alive beyond the grave. And so, Spain waits. Throughout the 1950s and 60s, the country becomes a study in contradictions. On one hand, you have modernization, highways, new universities, American investment. Spain becomes a tourist hotspot. Cheap wine, sunny beaches, flamenco on demand. The world starts to forget that the regime is built on silence and fear. But you also have secret police, forced confessions, banned books, and executions carried out at dawn. Families whisper about disappeared uncles. Entire generations grow up thinking democracy is a French word for chaos. And when students protest, they are met with batons and bullets. You stand in the middle of a university plaza in 1968 and watch as riot police charge a group of young men holding up signs that say freedom. One boy, no older than 20, falls hard and doesn't get back up. His friend kneels beside him, stunned. Then someone whispers. He quoted Rousseau in class. They were watching him. Ferdinand would have nodded in approval. Divide, suppress, survive. And Franco does survive. For decades. But time, as always, has other plans. By the early 1970s, Franco is failing. His health deteriorates. His circle of advisors shrinks. The global world changes. Vietnam, civil rights, rock music, decolonization, feminism, and Spain looks increasingly like an aging uncle who still calls every refrigerator a magic icebox. Franco, ever the planner, tries to tighten control. He finally names Juan Carlos as his official successor, making him king in waiting in 1969. The ceremony is stiff, weird, and drenched in Catholic symbolism. Juan Carlos smiles, but says almost nothing. He knows his role, obedient steward of the Catalos' legacy. But here's the quiet secret no one sees coming. Juan Carlos has other plans. He's watched Spain suffer long enough. Watched silence kill ideas. Watched memories of Ferdinand's tyranny get recycled in fascist uniforms. And when Franco finally dies in 1975, Juan Carlos steps into power and begins dismantling everything. But hold that thought, because right now, as Franco lies dying in a hospital bed, kept alive with tubes and whispers of sainthood, you feel it. The room is cold. The air is still. And Ferdinand VII is there, leaning against the wall in his velvet robe, arms crossed. One final monarch, try to whisper into a dying general's ear. You open your eyes in 1975, and for once, it's quiet. The guns are silent. The slogans are fading. In a darkened hospital room just outside Madrid, Francisco Franco takes his final breath, tubes tangled in his arms like vines around a crumbling statue. After 36 years of dictatorship, Spain is free. Or almost. Because technically, when Franco dies, the crown passes, not to an elected president, not to a revolutionary committee, but to a man who bears the Bourbon name like a family curse, Juan Carlos I. And somewhere, in the basement archives of the royal palace, Ferdinand VII's portrait watches with amusement. After 44 years in exile, the monarchy is back. But this time, something's different. Because unlike Ferdinand, who used restoration to smother liberalism, crush opposition, and bathe himself in divine right, Juan Carlos begins his reign by doing the exact opposite. He lights a match and starts burning Franco's legacy down, piece by piece. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Within just 3 years of Franco's death, King Juan Carlos I oversaw one of the most successful transitions to democracy in modern European history. He legalized political parties, allowed free elections, ended censorship, and supported a new democratic constitution, effectively dismantling the very authoritarian regime that crowned him. Yes, you heard that right. A king, educated under a dictator, groomed to be a figurehead for fascism, chose to end his own absolute power. You walk beside him in those early months. The press is cautious. The generals glare. Franco's old ministers still occupy the government benches, and they're expecting Juan Carlos to continue the plan, to be a puppet in a military uniform. Instead, he refuses. He appoints a reformist prime minister, Adolfo Suarez, a man with just enough conservative credentials to slip past the old guard, but a revolutionary's heart beating underneath his tailored suit. Together, they begin what Spaniards now call la transition, the transition. But it's no fairy tale. You remember what Ferdinand taught Spain. That power is never surrendered peacefully. That compromise is weakness. That tradition must be preserved at all costs. Those lessons are still baked into the military, into the church, into the bones of the bureaucracy. So when Juan Carlos begins legalizing socialist and communist parties, freeing political prisoners, and reopening debate halls, the right starts to panic. And in 1981, just when you think the ghost is gone, it strikes back. On the night of February 23rd, as Parliament debates who will be the next prime minister, a group of armed civil guards storm the chamber. Guns raised, shots fired into the ceiling. Deputies scream. Ministers dive under benches. It is a coup attempt, the last gasp of Franco's old world. You're there, standing behind a velvet curtain, breath caught in your throat. On the television screens, the entire country watches in stunned silence. Tanks roll through Madrid. Military commanders hold backroom meetings. It feels like Ferdinand, Spain, is trying to come back from the grave. And then, just past midnight, Juan Carlos appears on national television. He's wearing a full military uniform. But the message is clear. This is not a show of force. It's a stand for democracy. In calm, resolute tones, he denounces the coup, declares loyalty to the Constitution, orders the army back to their barracks. You watch from living rooms across Spain as families cry. Grandparents clutch rosaries. Students, many of whom had never lived under democracy, cheer. One journalist calls it the moment Spain grew a spine. And with that speech, the coup collapses. The tanks retreat. The rebels surrender. And democracy survives. Historians still argue how much Juan Carlos knew in advance. Was he playing a double game? Did he make deals behind the scenes? Some say he was always a closet liberal. Others believe it was pure pragmatism. But whatever the truth, the result was a miracle of modern monarchy. A Bourbon king, born in exile, saves democracy with a midnight broadcast. Now, here's your quirky tidbit. After the failed coup, toy companies across Spain released miniature action figures of Juan Carlos in military dress, complete with a tiny plastic microphone. They sold out in days. Kids called him Super Ray. You walk through post-coup Spain and feel something transforming. Censorship laws are repealed. Satirical magazines flourish. Punk rock explodes. The church is politely shown the door in matters of law and education. And in 1986, Spain officially joins the European Economic Community, the ancestors of today's EU. For the first time in centuries, Spain is not lagging behind Europe. It's leading reform. And yet, you still see Ferdinand's ghost. Less now, fainter, but there. In the judicial system, where vestiges of authoritarian law still shape decisions. In rural provinces, where superstition and suspicion of big government run deep. In the far-right groups who still whisper about the glory of old Spain, when kings ruled and the church was law and women knew their place. But most of all, you see Ferdinand in Spain's relationship with truth. Even in democracy, there's an unease about revisiting the past. The Civil War is still painful. Franco's crimes, largely untouched. A pact of forgetting, Pacto del Olvido, takes hold. Politicians and citizens alike decide not to dig too deep. Let's not reopen wounds, they say. Let sleeping monarchs lie. You stand in a high school classroom in 1989. The teacher schemes over the dictatorship in 2 paragraphs. Ferdinand's name is barely mentioned. The textbooks emphasize the glory of Spain's new economy, the vibrancy of democracy, the success of the king. But history, as always, keeps receipts. Because even as Spain moves forward, modern, vibrant, open, it carries a double inheritance. One from Juan Carlos, of reconciliation, democracy, and European integration. And one from Ferdinand VII, of trauma, suppression, and fear of change. These legacies coexist like oil and water. But for now, at the close of the 1980s, democracy holds. Juan Carlos remains popular, even beloved. The monarchy is secure, not as ruler, but as symbol of velvet-wrapped institution that no longer demands obedience, but offers a quiet kind of continuity. And you sit on a rooftop in Madrid, listening to the hum of late-night scooters and the sound of teenagers singing along to a cassette tape. The stars overhead are faint but visible. You realize this is the first time in centuries that Spain has no king plotting revenge, no general poised for coup, no priest scripting policy. It's not perfect, it's not healed, but it's free, and somewhere far away, in a crypt dusted with silence, Ferdinand VII turns over in his tomb. By the time the 1990s roll in, you're gliding over a Spain that looks nothing like the country Ferdinand VII left behind. Gone are the foreign mercenaries at the gates of Madrid. Gone are the sycophantic priests with red ink on their fingers. Gone are the royal scribes, the inquisitors, the absolutist decrees written by candlelight on goat parchment. This Spain is glowing in technicolor, walking confidently into shopping malls, uploading its culture, and flirting with the future. But don't relax just yet, because this is also when Ferdinand's ghost gets clever. He stops pacing castle corridors and starts drifting through airwaves, media, and myth. You now find him in memory, specifically in how Spain chooses to remember its past. Let's begin with your mainstream historical fact. By the 1990s, Spain had become one of Europe's most successful post-dictatorship democracies, boasting strong institutions, a booming economy, and a modern welfare state. But its transition was built on a collective choice to avoid digging into the past, a policy famously known as the Pacto del Olvido, or Pact of Forgetting. And that's the strange paradox. Politicians, journalists, and even everyday Spaniards began to treat history like a fragile vase, beautiful to glance at, dangerous to touch. Schools taught democracy, yes, but skipped over atrocities. Television honored the monarchy as a unifying force, but tiptoed around the crown's past allegiance with fascism. Meanwhile, Franco's crimes remained largely unprosecuted. His collaborators kept their pensions. His tomb, in Valle de los Caídos, still received flowers. You walk through a bookstore in Seville and browse a history section full of conspiracies, half-truths, and revisionist biographies. There's a new fascination with royalty, old maps, aristocratic scandals. And guess who's enjoying a quiet comeback? Ferdinand VII, rebranded. You find academic papers calling him a misunderstood traditionalist. Some praise his commitment to Catholic values. A few even question whether his censorship was really that bad. After all, didn't he save Spain from chaos? This is your quirky tidbit. In 1996, a popular historical novel featured Ferdinand as a romantic antihero who secretly funded orphanages and longed for liberty but was betrayed by circumstance. It sold over 100,000 copies and was even adapted into a short-lived telenovela. Viewers were divided. Was he a tyrant or just a sad boy with a crown? And you, sitting in front of a tube TV with a glass of Rioja, start to worry. Because Spain isn't just forgetting the brutality. It's mythologizing the trauma. At the same time, the monarchy, reborn under Juan Carlos, enters its golden age. The king is hailed internationally for his role in preserving democracy. He appears in glossy magazines, cuts ribbons, rides bicycles with Scandinavian royalty. In 1992, during the Barcelona Olympics, he and Queen Sofia stand beaming at the center of global attention. Spain feels good about itself. Too good, maybe. The economy's booming. New highways slash through the countryside. Museums fill with Picasso and Moreau. Mobile phones and IKEA invade middle-class life. There's a vibe of celebration in the air, what Spaniards call una movida, an exuberant movement of art, noise, and reinvention. But under that, you sense the cost of forgetting. The Civil War? Still a taboo at most dinner tables. Franco's victims? Still lying in mass graves under unmarked hills. Ferdinand's legacy? Now something for glossy royal documentaries, with sweeping violin music and clever euphemisms like politically complicated reign. Historians still argue whether the Pacto del Olvido was a necessary healing mechanism or a dangerous act of historical denial. Some say the trauma was too fresh to process in the 70s and 80s. Others believe democracy can't truly thrive until it looks at its own scars in daylight. Meanwhile, Spain becomes more divided, quietly. In Catalonia, whispers of independence grow louder. In the Basque Country, ETA, a separatist group, continues to kill and bomb in the name of autonomy. And across rural Spain, people begin to ask whether democracy has really delivered or just replaced old masters with flashier branding. Even the royal family, once untouchable, begins to crack. Juan Carlos, the once modern king, starts to seem outdated, aloof. The country is no longer enchanted by pageantry. Young people prefer satire to ceremony. And in the margins of gossip magazines, quiet scandals begin to brew. Rumors of mistresses, offshore accounts, lavish hunting trips. You recall Ferdinand's court, bloated, indulgent, blind to suffering. Is history repeating or just rhyming? In 1997, Spain passes a historical memory law aimed at recognizing victims of Franco's regime. It promises truth, justice, and reparation. But implementation is slow, toothless, and mostly symbolic. The ghosts remain buried, and so do the bodies. You visit a small village outside Burgos, where old women still leave flowers in secret by a crumbling wall. "They shot my father here," one whispers, "but we were told never to speak of it. Not under Franco, not after." She doesn't know who Ferdinand VII was, but she lives in his aftermath. You look around, and the signs are everywhere. The hesitation in political debates, the reverence for uniformed authority, the discomfort with protest, the obsession with appearances. Spain has changed, but it hasn't reckoned. And that's how ghosts survive. They don't haunt you with chains and moans. They live in myths, silences, and fictions so comfortable that no one dares break them. But something is shifting. A new generation is rising. One that doesn't remember Franco. One that asks questions teachers can't answer. One that downloads documentaries and finds archived footage online. They don't fear ghosts. They want to name them. And as you drift through a high school in Valencia, listening to students debate whether the monarchy still makes sense, you realize Ferdinand VII's second life is ending. The illusion is cracking. And what comes next might be reckoning. Now the year is 2014, and you're standing beneath a throne that's about to be emptied. After decades of carefully curated photo ops, handshakes with popes, and speeches about unity, King Juan Carlos quietly announces his abdication. Not with fanfare, not with tears, but with the voice of a man who knows the spell has broken. And just like that, another Bourbon steps off the stage. But not before history catches up with him. Because while Juan Carlos had once been hailed as the king who brought Spain into democracy, who stared down a coup and outlived Franco's generals, he ends his reign drenched in scandal. The kind that Ferdinand VII would have smirked at behind his fan of censorship and piety. Let's begin with your mainstream historical fact. King Juan Carlos abdicated in 2014 following a series of personal and financial scandals, including allegations of corruption, extramarital affairs, and a controversial elephant hunting trip in Botswana during Spain's economic crisis. His departure marked the most serious crisis for the Spanish monarchy since its restoration in 1975. So what happened? In 2012, Spain was knee-deep in a brutal financial meltdown. Unemployment hit 25%. Youth unemployment soared past 50%. Families lost homes. Entire towns were shuttered. The government imposed austerity, slashing pensions, wages, and public services. People were hurting. And then came the photo. Juan Carlos, dressed in khaki safari gear, grinning beside the corpse of a majestic elephant he'd just shot on a luxury hunting trip in Botswana. The trip had cost tens of thousands of euros. It was paid for by a mysterious Saudi billionaire. And worst of all, the king had broken his hip there, requiring a secret emergency flight and surgery, which taxpayers would eventually fund. Cue national outrage. You walk the streets of Madrid as protesters chant, "No nos representan." They don't represent us. Signs sprout from balconies. Juan Carlos, go home. For the first time in decades, whispers of abolishing the monarchy become open demands. And that was just the beginning. Because soon, prosecutors launched an investigation into Juan Carlos's finances. Swiss bank accounts, undeclared gifts, suspicious commissions tied to construction contracts in Saudi Arabia. One figure kept coming up, €65 million, allegedly transferred from the Saudis to the king's offshore accounts. When pressed, his lawyers called it a gift. Historians still argue whether these financial deals were technically illegal or just deeply unethical. Some insist Juan Carlos was merely following the unspoken rules of monarchy, privilege in exchange for silence. Others claim he betrayed the democratic ideals he once championed. But the damage was done. The old image of the king as the nation's father figure, who guided Spain out of dictatorship, was now tangled in whispers of greed, secrecy, and betrayal. And as the country reeled from the Great Recession, a generational rift opened. You step into a student union meeting at the University of Salamanca. The room is crammed with 20-somethings arguing about the monarchy, not whether it should modernize, but whether it should exist at all. I respect what Juan Carlos did in '81. One says, but we're not living in the past. Another waves a tattered Republican flag and says, let's not pretend a king is democracy. Meanwhile, Juan Carlos disappears from public life. He retreats, first to palaces, then to silence. Eventually, in 2020, as pressure from prosecutors mounts, he leaves Spain entirely, exiled again, just like his father Alfonso XIII and his ancestor Charles IV. He flees to Abu Dhabi, of all places, citing a desire not to distract from the work of his son. And so, the crown passes to a new monarch, Felipe VI. He is young, polished, professionally dull. Where Juan Carlos had charm and military swagger, Felipe brings spreadsheets and solemnity. He declines his father's inheritance. He renounces personal offshore assets. He even cuts his own salary by 20% to set a moral tone. Felipe becomes the monarch of austerity. And you'd think that would be enough. But the world's changed. Spain is now a digital country. A meme-powered, social media-infested, information-soaked society where transparency isn't just expected, it's demanded. Scandals can't be silenced with a royal decree. Public opinion doesn't wait for royal permission to evolve. The monarchy, once above politics, is now a target. And nowhere is that tension sharper than in Catalonia. The Catalan independence movement, which had simmered for decades, boils over in 2017. Regional leaders hold an unauthorized referendum. Police crack down violently. The central government invokes Article 155 to strip Catalonia of its autonomy. And Felipe? Instead of mediating, he delivers a scathing national address, blaming Catalan leaders and offering zero sympathy for peaceful protesters beaten in the streets. It's a Ferdinand-style speech, uncompromising, centralized, nationalistic. In Catalonia, royal portraits are burned in plazas. Schoolchildren draw cartoons of kings with devil horns. The monarchy is no longer seen as neutral. It's now an institution of the Spanish state and therefore part of the problem. Here's your quirky tidbit. After Felipe's 2017 speech, Catalan Twitter users created a fake monarchy simulator game called Rey o Ruin, King or Scoundrel, where the player makes royal decisions and loses popularity no matter what. It became a minor viral hit. You stand on a rooftop in Barcelona now, watching fireworks flash above a crowd chanting in 3 languages. Flags of every color dance beneath them. The moment feels symbolic, a nation trying to split itself in two, while the old idea of monarchy struggles to stretch across the divide. And you realize something chilling. Ferdinand VII isn't just a ghost of the past. He's a system. Every time Spain chooses order over justice, every time a powerful man is forgiven because he wears a crown, every time historical memory is suppressed in the name of peace, Ferdinand lives again. But this generation, they're not afraid of ghosts. They dig up the graves, ask the dangerous questions, break the cycles. The monarchy now exists on a kind of historical probation. It's tolerated, examined, debated. Spain no longer bows to kings. It measures them. And though the ghost still lingers in old laws, in statues, in the lullabies of conservative nostalgia, it's fainter now. Because the people have learned how to name it. And once a ghost is named, it begins to fade. And so, here you are, You've trudged through centuries of royal greed, powdered lies, silk-draped corruption, and velvet-throne violence. You've watched Spain stumble through empires, dictatorships, exile, and rebirth. You've followed the heavy-footed ghost of Ferdinand VII as he slithered through every corridor of power, every clause of silence, every smirk beneath a gilded crown. And now, it's the 2020s and you stand on the warm, cracked stones of a public square, not in a palace, but outside it. All around you, young people laugh under a sun that feels earned. A grandmother with a cane takes a selfie beside a Republican graffiti mural. A busker sings a Catalan protest ballad while a child claps to the rhythm. Democracy, fragile and messy, lives here, but is not guaranteed, because Ferdinand's ghost isn't the only one still lingering. There's the ghost of forgetting, the phantom of comfort, the tempting lullaby that says, don't dig, don't ask, let the past sleep. And Spain, like any nation with deep wounds and shallow bandages, is tempted to listen. But something has changed, and that change begins with naming. Let's begin with your mainstream historical fact. In 2022, Spain passed the Democratic Memory Law, a bold step meant to confront the legacies of Franco's dictatorship. It includes the exhumation of mass graves, the removal of fascist symbols, and the creation of a national DNA bank to help identify victims of the civil war and repression. It's not perfect, but it's real. You walk with a team of forensic archaeologists into a sun-scorched valley near Granada. They brush away centuries of soil with trembling hands. A tattered shoe, a rusted belt buckle, a rosary clenched between teeth. Each fragment is a sentence Spain had been afraid to speak. A woman, gray-haired, quiet, presses a photo to her chest and whispers, "He was 20. They took him at night. We were told not to ask." Now she asks. She dares to ask. And in that moment, Ferdinand VII, who ruled by erasure, who governed through terror, who built an entire throne on silence, loses. Because now, Spain looks backward with eyes wide open. Of course, there are those who resist. The far-right resurfaces, wearing suits instead of sabers. They defend traditional Spain, question the memory laws, call for national unity at the expense of truth. Some still toast to Franco in private clubs. Some mutter about the glory of kings. But their numbers shrink with every history lesson taught honestly, with every unmarked grave given a name, with every monument to oppression torn down and replaced with a plaque that says, "Never again." You stand in a classroom in Valencia where a young teacher is explaining the Bourbon Restoration, not as destiny, not as divine, but as a political deal. She shows students portraits of Ferdinand VII and asks, "What do you see?" One child raises a hand, a scared man who wanted everyone else to be scared too. The class laughs, gently. This is how empires end, not in explosions, but in clarity. Here's your quirky tidbit. In 2023, a viral TikTok trend featured Spanish teens acting out royal scandal duets, mock reenactments of King Ferdinand VII's more absurd moments, marrying his niece, revoking constitutions, fainting at court. The hashtag? Hashtag drama bourbon. The caption? Don't be a Ferdinand. You smile, because even as Spain stumbles toward the future, it now has mirrors and memes to keep it honest. The monarchy remains for now. Felipe VI walks carefully, speaks precisely, and keeps his family out of the tabloids. But the institution's role is no longer sacred, is debated openly, investigated, held to account. Even the royal immunity laws are being reconsidered, because power in this new Spain is no longer above the people. It is borrowed from them. And you leave the square and walk through Madrid at dusk. There's a statue of Ferdinand VII near the royal palace, flanked by tourists who barely glance at the plaque. One teen in a Real Madrid jersey mutters, "He was the worst, right?" His friend nods, half laughing, "Yeah, I think so." The pervy one, "That's all Ferdinand gets now." A chuckle, a shrug. The shadow no longer reaches the crown. Because Spain, for all its stumbles, has learned something its 19th century kings never did. Power doesn't last, but memory can. And in memory, lies the ability to choose. To name, to confront, to heal, to change, and maybe, just maybe, to rest. Now, slow your breath. Let the lights in your mind soften, like the candles of a chapel after Mass, like the first sun creeping over a battlefield long abandoned. The dust has settled, the kings have left, and somewhere, far behind you, the doors of the past finally begin to close.